Operation Interstellar by George O. Smith. Paul Grayson walked the city street slowly. He was sauntering toward the spaceport, but he was in no hurry. He had allowed himself plenty of time to breathe the fresh spring air, to listen to the myriad of sounds made by his fellow men, and to revel in the grand freedom that being out in the open gave him. Soon enough he would be breathing canned air, pungent with the odor of compressor oil and the tang of the greenery used to replenish the oxygen, unable to walk freely more than a dozen steps, and unable to see what lies beyond his viewports. Occasionally his eyes looked along the low southern sky towards Alpha Centauri. Proxima, of course, could not be resolved by the naked eye, much less the stinking little overheated mote that rotated about Proxima. Obviously unfit for human life and patently incapable of spawning life of its own, it was Paul Grayson's destination, and would be his home for a few days or a few weeks, depending entirely upon whether things went good or bad. Only during the last 4 out of 2,000 million years of its life had this planet been useful. Man needed a place to stand, not to move the earth with Archimedes' lever, but to survey the galaxy. Proxima Centauri I was the only planet in the trinary, and as bad as it was useful for a space station. In an hour, Paul Grayson would be locked in a capsule of metal, hurling himself through space toward Proxima I. He was looking forward to 10 days cooped up in a spacecraft of the type furnished by the Bureau of Astrogation to its engineers, which was a far cry from the sumptuous craft run by the big brass. His confines would be lined with functional scientific equipment. His air supply would be medically acceptable but aesthetically horrible, and his vision limited to the cabin, for beyond the viewports would be only the formless, endless, abysmal blackness of absolutely nothing, while the ship mounted into multiples of the speed of light. Then days in a building filled to the dome with power equipment and radio gear, timing mechanisms and recorders, and a refrigerator set up that struggled with the awesome heat poured into Proxima I by its close by luminary, but which succeeded only in lowering the temperature to the point where the potting compound in the transformers did not run out, where the calibrating resistors would not change their values, where the recording machines would still make a record. And then again more days in the ship before it returned to Earth. Call it 30 days, and understand why Paul Grayson sauntered along, killing time in the fresh air before taking off. Paul grinned. 4 years ago he had arrived a full hour early and wasted the hour in the smelly ship instead of filling his lungs with clean, fresh air. Never again. He would arrive a full 5 minutes before check-in time. He heard some radio music, its tones stripped of high frequencies from its passage through the slit of a partially opened window. He sniffed the air and laughed because someone was cooking corned beef and cabbage. Then he was out of range of the radio music. Paul liked music. He hummed a tune as he walked, and then as fancy struck him, he started to sing. It was faint singing. It would not have carried more than a few feet, but it sufficed for Paul. It was a refrain from an early atomic age ballad. Round and round and round go the deuterons. Round and round the magnet swings them. Round and round and round go the deuterons. Smack into target goes the ion beam. Paul stopped his song because the interesting click of high heels on the sidewalk pointed to the approach of someone who might view a cappella singing as an indication of inebriation. She was coming towards him, walking on the same side of the sidewalk. Her step was quick and light, and the slight breeze outlined her frock against her body, revealing and at the same time concealing just enough to quicken the pulse and awaken the interest. Paul was 30 and unmarried, and experienced enough to catalogue her shrewdly. No crude attempt at pickup would work on this woman. She was sure of herself and obviously could not want for admirers. It would take careful strategy over a period of time to get to first base with a woman like her. An inept campaigner would be called out on strikes, and Paul Grayson had to be on the way to Centauri within the hour, which automatically eliminated the initial step in any plausible scheme to wrangle an introduction. Paul Grayson grinned ruefully. It seemed to him that when he had hours to spend and nothing to do, the streets were barren of presentable women, while the most interesting specimens of womanhood smiled and offered their charms when he was en route toward some schedule that could not be delayed. This was woman enough to make a man forget his timetables, almost. She came forward, her face lighted by the street lamp that Paul had just passed. Blue-eyed and fair-skinned, her hurried route was on a collision course with his, and with a minute shake of his head, because he had neither the time nor the inclination to attempt anything as crude as striking up an acquaintance by barring her path, Paul angled his course aside. She angled too. "Hello," she said brightly. "I thought you'd be along sooner." Paul Grayson gulped. Obviously, she mistook him for someone else, and a faint feeling of jealousy ran through him for the lucky man who owned her affections. The street lamp behind him must have cast heavy shadows across his face, making identification difficult. He opened his mouth to explain away the mistake, but the girl came up to him, hardly slacking her pace until the last possible moment. Then, instead of speaking, Paul found his parted mouth met by hers. Her lips were warm. Her arms came around him in a quick embrace, and his arms instinctively closed about her waist. Paul kissed back, cheerfully accepting the pleasure of the error with a sort of devilish glee. Then he stepped back. "I'm sorry," he said, "that I am not the guy you thought I was." She looked up at him with a blink. Her expression changed to surprise, and then her mouth opened in a scream as her eyes flicked away from him and centered over his left shoulder. Paul started to whirl, but someone dropped the North Pole on the back of his skull. It chilled him completely. Her scream rang in his ears as he fell forward. Vaguely, he felt the silk of her dress against his outstretched hands, and then against his cheek, just before the sidewalk rose up to grind against his face. Something pulled at his coat. Then he felt nothing more, only the frightened scream of the woman that rang in his ears, shrill, angry, fearful, and never ending. Until Paul realized that the siren wail was not her scream, but the ringing in his own ears, and that the girl was sitting asprawl on the sidewalk with his head between her thighs. She was rubbing the nape of his neck with her fingertips, quietly erasing the pain bit by bit. The threshold of ringing in his ears diminished, and his field of vision increased as the darting lights went away, and Paul Grayson then could hear the sound of running feet and the babble of voices. "What happened?" "This man was clipped by a thug." "You saw it?" came the voices in a mad garble of scrambled speeches. "Right in front of my eyes." The babble broke into many and varied subjects: curiosity, both morbid and Samaritan; anger, both righteous and superficial, but both directed at the things that make such happenings possible; suggestions, both sensible and absurd; and offers, both welcome and ridiculous. Paul groaned and tried to lift his hand to the raw spot on his chin where the sidewalk had removed some hide. The woman looked down at him and smiled in a wan, apprehensive manner. "You're all right?" Paul struggled to sit up and made it with her help. The wave of pain rose and localized in his head at about 40 degrees right latitude. It made him want to carry his head at an angle with his neck ducked down below the level of the knot of pain. Hands helped him to his feet, led him across the sidewalk, while he became stronger by the moment. He shook his head to clear it and winced as the motion caused the knot of pain to vibrate nastily. "What happened?" he asked in a quavering voice. It sounded like someone else's voice to him, and surprised at the sound of it, he repeated the question. It still sounded like someone else's voice, and while he was wondering if his voice would sound like that for the rest of his life, the girl explained what had happened. Paul missed most of it, but then asked another question. "Did you see him?" "No," she said. Her voice was regretful, yet tinted with a dash of amusement. "He sort of rose out of the shadow behind you. You're a tall man, you know. All I saw was a ragged silhouette." "He hit you. You fell. I screamed. He grabbed at your wallet." Her voice trailed away unhappily. Paul smiled. "Nothing in it but personal papers, all replaceable. Not more than a few dollars. I'd have handed it over rather than get this clip on the skull. Too bad you couldn't see him." The touch of amusement came again. "I had my eyes closed, sort of." Paul smiled again. Inwardly, he was welcoming the footpad to the contents of his wallet and accepting the bop on the bean as the price to pay for an introduction to the girl. Someone in the crowd said, "You'd better come inside until you feel all right." Paul shook his head and was happy to find that the knot inside had diminished to a faint pinpoint. His voice was sounding more like his own, too. "I've got to go," he said. "But—" The wail of sirens came and a police car dashed to the curb. It spilled policemen from all doors, who came warily. "What's going on here?" demanded the sergeant. Paul explained. "You'd better come to the station and lodge a complaint." Paul shook his head. "I'm Paul Grayson of the Bureau of Astrogation," he said. "I could prove it, but the crook has my identification papers. I'm due to take off for space within—" Paul looked at his watch. "Within 40 minutes," he finished. "We'll require a complaint." "Can't you take it?" pleaded Paul. "Good Lord, man, I can't identify a criminal that clipped me from behind. Hell, the only contact I had with him was hitting the back of my head against his blackjack." The sergeant looked at the woman. "You can't help?" "Not much more. He was just a blurred shadow to me. He looked like any other man wearing dark clothing which can be changed all too easily." The sergeant went to the police car and spoke to the main office over the radio. He returned in a moment. "The lieutenant says we're to run you over to the spaceport and take depositions en route. That'll save time for you, and it will get the dope for our records that we must have. You too, miss." "I'm Nora Phillips. I'll go along, of course. Will you have one of your men keep an eye out for a tall man who should have been passing here by now? He's overdue. He will be Tommy Morgan. We had a date, but I came out to meet him on his way to my home. Tell him what happened and explain that I'll return home as soon as this matter is taken care of." The sergeant smiled. "Toby, you take this stand and ask everybody that comes along if he's Mr. Morgan. Then explain." "Right." The ride, so far as official information went, was strictly a waste of time. Paul made a mental note of Nora Phillips' address and telephone number, and decided that the incident called for good reason to renew the acquaintance. The sergeant made it easy by telling them, "When you return from your trip, Mr. Grayson, I'll ask you to come into the station and make a formal complaint. You'll be there too, Miss Phillips." "I'll be glad to help," she told them. Then she turned to Paul. "You're with Astrogation?" He nodded. "But why Proxima? I heard it was a completely useless place." Paul shook his head. "We want to measure the distance to better accuracy than heliocentric parallax will permit us," he said. "We know the speed of light to a fine decimal, and we can measure time to even a finer degree. So we started a radio beam toward Centauri 4 years ago, and it will be arriving in not too long a time. Then we'll have the distance to a nice detail of perfection." Nora thought for a moment. "I suppose you're ultimately aiming at Neosol," she suggested. "That's the idea. But Neosol is 100 light years away. 143 at the last count, Paul corrected. So it will take 140? No, he smiled. Less than 3 years from now. You see, 7 light years is the greatest distance that separates the stars between here and Neil's Sol. We've got a nice network of radio beams crisscrossing the pathway between here and Neil's Sol. Oh, he admitted with a smile, the triangulation beams will be arriving from now until 100 years from now. But they're mostly check beams, and the final beam from Earth to Neo Terra will take the full time. But in the meantime, we can refine our space charts using the network of beams once they start to arrive. And each time one of the triangulation check beams gets home, we'll be able to refine the charts even more. But there's no sense in waiting for a century and a half. The sergeant looked at Paul. You're certain you can fly with that bump on the head? Sure. Why not let someone else take it? Paul shook his head. It's my job, he said quickly. But there must be someone else that can do it. What if you died? Oh, there are others trained in this sort of job in that case. Why not let one of them take it then? Paul shook his head. I'm all right, he said. He realized that his insistence was too vigorous, and that his reasons were too lame. But he could not let them know why it was so important that Paul Grayson go in person. If Haedaecker got wind of what Paul carried in his spacecraft, there would be hell to pay. He thought of a plausible excuse. Most of them aren't on Earth right now. Couldn't you call one of them? Paul smiled ruefully. They're outside of the solar system. The sergeant nodded. The Z-wave can't cross interstellar space, he said. It was a statement thrown in to display his knowledge to the technician from the Bureau of Astrogation, and also a leader for more conversation. Paul did not bite. That's Haedaecker's theory, added the sergeant, isn't it? He added after a moment of silence. Haedaecker's theory is that the Z-wave propagates only in a region under the influence of solar activity, explained Paul. He looked out of the police car and saw the spaceport only a few moments away. Then he talked volubly to fill in the time so that he could be off without further questioning. Haedaecker had plenty of evidence to support his theory, but they were all missing one point that was plain as the nose on Haedaecker's face. We can talk with ease from the Zero Laboratory on Pluto to the Solar Lab on Mercury, to the boys who are working in the poisonous atmosphere of Jupiter, to the extra-Terran paleontologists who are combing Venus, said Paul. And the Radiation Laboratory sent a gang to try the 5 planets of Sirius. Again, they got the Z-wave working after a bit of fiddling with the tuning. But we're not able to get so much as a whisper from Sol to Proxima Centauri via Z-wave. What started Haedaecker thinking was the experiment they tried about 10 years ago, Paul went on, before anybody could interrupt. No one can measure the velocity of the Z-wave, you know. So they started a spacecraft running right away from Sol. So long as they were within a fair radius, the Z-wave went both ways easily. But once they went into superdrive and raced away from Sol and got out beyond the orbit of Pluto by quite a bit, they lost contact completely. They made some measurements, but these were quite unsuccessful. All we know is that we can use the Z-wave for speech for a long distance beyond the orbit of Pluto, but beyond some distance that might lie between 10 times that orbit and, I think they tried it at a light month, the Z-wave dies out abruptly. It falls off like a cliff, you know. There's no apparent attenuation of the Z-wave so long as it is strong enough to get there. Beyond that, there's not even the whisper of a signal. It's a peculiar thing, but we know very little about the Z-wave, and... The driver brought the police car to a screeching halt. Here you are, folks, he chirped. Paul got out of the car quickly. I'll be back, he told the sergeant. I'll call you. And then to Nora Phillips, he added, I'll call you too. "Do," she said pointedly. "I'd like to know more about the Z-wave." Paul nodded amiably. He did not voice his inner thought. "So would I, baby." The police car U-turned in the broad roadway and headed off to return Nora Phillips to her home and to pick up the officer set to sentry duty. Paul waved them off and then started to walk up the pavement towards the administration building. He was feeling better. Everything pleased him vastly. The knot inside of his head was gone. He had made the acquaintance of a very delectable armful of femininity. And now he had been chauffeured to the spaceport by none other than the city police department, complete with siren. On his way up the sidewalk, Paul planned the retort perfect. Anticipating some humorous sarcasm on the mode of his arrival, Paul hoped to crush any verbal volley with unanswerable repartee. Usually Paul's fount of boundless wit ran just a trifle slow, following the definition of a bon mot, something you think of on the way home. This time he was going to be prepared. He swung the door airily and strode in, his tongue poised over a few words of terse wit. The guard looked at him and swallowed a large lump. "How in hell did you get out?" he gasped. This was not according to plan. Unfortunately, the guard had not read Paul's script, and the prepared answer would not fit the question. "I was never in," said Paul lamely, again wishing he had a tongue full of ready wit instead of fumbling for a prepared speech. "The hell you weren't." Paul took it from there, ignoring the fact that the guard had not followed Paul's mental conversation. "That was a car reserved for very important personages," he said. "From now on, you can call me Viper." The guard bypassed this. "But how did you get out?" he asked. His voice was almost a plea. "You didn't pass me." "Were you guarding the jail too?" chuckled Paul. "Fast man, no?" "You came in a taxicab the first time." "Ah, yes, but that was years ago, before people knew of my brilliance, importance, and high station. Now—" "Years ago, my eye. Less than 15 minutes ago." "I did not." "You did." "Not me." Paul's feeling of airy well-being came down a few thousand feet and mired in a cumulus cloud. "Look, Grayson, you came in a taxicab and breezed in here about 15 minutes ago, as though you had only a minute to spare. You're thinking of someone else." "Your picture said Paul Grayson, and so did your identification. How else would I be knowing you?" "You've seen me often enough." "Maybe, but don't forget that I see a few thousand people every day, and I know you only well enough to know that you do own bona fide credentials. You got 'em?" Paul blinked. A great searing light was starting to cut through the cobwebs of his brain. The airy feeling of well-being dropped below the cumulus cloud and made a one-point landing on strictly solid ground. "Look," he said soberly, "you claim a man came through here a few minutes ago resembling me?" "Unless you ain't who you are, he was you." "He wasn't me. My papers were stolen less than an hour ago. He must have—" The guard was no imbecile. He turned in a flash and hit a button on the desk beside him. An alarm bell rang in some inner room, and 4 more guards came tumbling out of a doorway, alert and ready for trouble. "Tommy," snapped the guard at the door, "go check Paul Grayson's ship. That's number BurAst 33-PG1." The guard looked at Paul carefully. "You're a dead ringer for the other guy that came through here," he said. "But you happen to know Paul Grayson's BurAst number. Anybody could memorize it." Paul watched the other guards tumble out of the building and head off across the spaceport on a dead run, drawing pistols as they went. He started to follow them. The guard barred his way. "No, you don't." "But that guy is stealing." "Maybe your name is Grayson, and maybe the other guy is Grayson. You look alike, and he had identification. I don't know Paul Grayson well enough to accept or deny you, or him. But until you show me credentials entitling you to roam this spaceport, you stay outside." "But—" "The boys I sent out there are capable. Don't get in their way. They might shoot the wrong Paul Grayson." "But—" "Get your credentials. Get some sort of identification." Paul looked at the big standard clock on the wall. "But I've got less than 8 minutes until takeoff time." "There's always tomorrow. You'll get cleared first or no entry, and that's final." "Hell's eternal bells!" exploded Paul. "The cops that brought me here did so because I was clipped on the bean and robbed." "It's my job," explained the guard quietly. "I don't want to be any more of a bastard than I have to be. If you're Paul Grayson and the cops know you were robbed, there's the telephone." Paul grabbed the phone and started to dial, fuming at the delay. First there was a few seconds until the dial tone came. Then Paul dialed the outside line. Another few seconds of delay until he could dial the number of the municipal police department. Then a bored voice asked, "Police headquarters, who's calling?" "This is Paul Grayson at the municipal spaceport." "What's the trouble out there?" "A crook stole my identification." "We'll send a man out to investigate." "No!" yelled Paul, to prevent the telephone operator from cutting off the line on the assumption that the call was closed. "You don't understand. I'm supposed to take off in 7 minutes." "We can't get a man there that quickly. You'll have to wait." "Look," said Paul hurriedly, "there's a squad car that just dropped me here. I was clipped on Talman Avenue, and they went there to investigate. They brought me here. Why not call them and ask them to come back and explain to the guards here what happened?" "I'll check that and take action," promised the voice in a completely bored tone. Paul fumed. There was the sound of a shot outside, followed instantly by the shrill, whining song of a ricochet, probably a glance from the hard metal flank of a parked spacecraft. The telephone went dead, and a second later came the dial tone again. Paul hung it up reluctantly. And that made it worse. Other hands were not as imbued with the importance of the project. To other hands it was a routine bit of trouble, not the matter of life and death that it was to Paul Grayson. Yet he to whom this thing was vastly important must sit with folded hands while men handled the matter in ponderous routine. The clock continued to turn inexorably. Paul's mathematically inclined mind went to work. It was less than 2 minutes since the police car left. Give them a minute to check up and a minute to make sure, then a minute to call the car. That was 3 of the precious 7 minutes gone to hell. If it took them as long to return as it took them to get where they were now, throw another 2 minutes down the drain, and that left 2 minutes in which to let the sergeant explain to the guard, clear Paul Grayson on a pro tem basis, get him across the spaceport to his ship, in, up, and away. He groaned. He wished frantically for some means of knowing what was going on, what measures were being made in his behalf. He wanted desperately to listen to the radio in the police car. He wanted to get on the radio himself and roar out explanations, to exhort them to greater effort. The siren wail of the police car cut into his thoughts, and Paul raced to the door to fling it open. The car slid to the curb, and the siren whined down the scale as the driver turned it off. They got out of the car and came up the walk briskly. "Hurry," he called. He cast a glance over his shoulder at the standard clock. He had 3 minutes. "Tell him who I am," he exploded breathlessly. The sergeant blinked. "But I don't know who you are." "But I've told you." "Hell," grunted the guard. "You've told me, too." To the sergeant, the guard said, "Do you know anything about all this?" "We got a call that this man had been clipped and robbed. He was." The sergeant looked at Nora Phillips. "Can you identify this man?" Nora bit her lip. "He's Paul Grayson." The guard speared Nora with a cold look. "Do you know that, or is it just what he said?" "Why, I've..." She's never met him otherwise," put in the sergeant. "That's true, but I think—" "Thinking ain't good enough." Nora looked at Paul. "Haven't you anything to show?" Paul shook his head. "Nothing that would cut any ice. Belt buckle with initial G, a few laundry marks and cleaner's marks. A checkbook in my hip pocket, but no name printed in it. I might check the balance against the bank, but that would be tomorrow morning. We might call Dr. Haedaecker, but by the time we arrived on some means of personal identification, take-off time would be gone and past." Paul paused, breathless, his whole body poised, tense, and his head bent to listen. There came the patter of feet outside. The standard clock was swinging toward the hour. 2 minutes remained, enough if all went quick and well. One of the guards burst in. He took a quick look around and spotted the police sergeant. "Good," he said, breathing heavily. "We've just shot a man out there. You're needed." "Was it the man who passed himself off as me?" shouted Paul Grayson. "As we came up to BurAst 33-PG1, this guy jumped from the airlock and started to run. We gave chase and lost him in the dark beyond a group of parked spacecraft. We called for him to halt. We found him again on the far side of the ships, and Joe fired a shot. It must have missed him because he kept running. And then we all started shooting, losing him behind another ship parked by the fence. You know, old Mutepol 3316. The way the guts are parked all over the spaceport and left to rust. A derelict if I ever saw one, and after this I'd say it was about time we cleaned up that old wreck." "Please hurry," blurted Paul. "We got to the fence where he climbed out over some junk stacked behind Mutepol 3316. We went after him, and then guess what?" "What?" "We found this character flat on his face in the road, as dead as a corpse as ever died." Paul exploded again. "That proves it," he said. "Now—" The spaceport guard shook his head. This shake was echoed by the police sergeant. "But I've work to do." The sergeant smiled unhappily. "We've work to do, too, son. I'll call you Grayson for the benefit of the doubt. There's not much doubt that something is highly rotten here. But we've got to be certain. There's been one slugging and robbery, the attempted theft of a spacecraft, and now a man killed by armed guards in performance of their duty. This is going to require clearing up before we let you go. But you know where to find me. I'm due on Proxima Centauri 1 to check the arrival of the Bureau of Astrogation survey beam. I'm to take off. If you are Paul Grayson." "If the other guy was Paul Grayson, would he have run from the cops?" The sergeant laughed bitterly. "This may come as a shock to you, son, but you have no idea how many of our nicest people, pillars of society and solid citizens, have secrets in their daily lives that make them shun law and order when law and order comes toward them with a drawn pistol, a subpoena, or a warrant for arrest." The loudspeaker came to life at that moment. "BurAst 33-PG1 taking off for Proxima Centauri 1. Timing signal for synchronization first check." The voice died, to be replaced by a series of clicks 1 second apart. "That's my notice." The guard snapped a switch. "Master Control," he said quietly. "This is Edwards, guard at the main gate. Hold the flight." "Hold the flight?" answered the speaker. "Hold the flight. We've had trouble here." "Is that what the shooting was all about?" The timing clicks died in the background. "What's the trouble?" "We've got 2 Paul Graysons wanting to take off." "Tell them to draw straws. This is costing money." "One of them—" "Hot damn it," yelled Paul. "I'm Paul Grayson, and I've—" "That you'll have to prove, son," said the sergeant. "Is dead," finished the guard. "Dead?" gasped the speaker. "Which one?" "It ain't funny," said the guard seriously. "Just hold the flight." "Okay, sport, but—" Paul spoke up. Can you get the Eleccal free for a course for tomorrow night?" "Who's that speaking?" "I'm Paul Grayson." "The live one, huh?" chuckled the unimpressed voice from the speaker. His bantering tone made Paul want to rip out his larynx with a crooked thumb and shove it down his throat. "Okay. We'll have the electronic calculator figure out a course for Proxima I for tomorrow night. Doubtless someone will take the flight." "Oh, damn," groaned Paul. "Why does this have to happen to me?" The sergeant smiled. "If this were the first attempt to steal a spacecraft, I'd be surprised." The guard shook his head. "It's more than that," he added sagely. "If the other guy was a thief bent on swiping a BurAst ship, he could have gone off in it 10 minutes before the second Paul Grayson arrived. He didn't. He was waiting for the takeoff signal. And if he were a crook, he hoped to fill in the real Paul Grayson's place. If he was the real Paul Grayson, we killed a frightened bureau man, and this bird here." Paul looked at the standard clock. It was now moving past the precise second marked for takeoff. He sighed resignedly and relaxed. "For the moment we'll assume that I am Paul Grayson," he said quietly. "So soon as we can find someone to corroborate me, the second part of your supposition will have no grounds." The sergeant shook his head. "I think we'd all best head for the station and wait this thing out." Paul gulped. "You're going to jug me?" "Both of you." "But you can't arrest me." "5 will get you 8," chuckled the sergeant. Nora Phillips came forward until she stood between Paul and the sergeant. "Why am I being arrested?" she demanded. The sergeant smiled affably. "No one is being arrested." "Why am I being detained, held, or otherwise prevented from enjoying my rights of freedom?" she snapped. Paul shrugged. "I've missed my takeoff," he said. "I'll have to wait until tomorrow anyway. And I can get identification in an hour or so without any trouble. In fact, I'll gladly go along with you if you'll permit me the telephone. They can bring my stuff down there and we can settle this quickly. But there is no reason to hold Miss Phillips." The sergeant turned to the woman and bowed deferentially. "Forgive a harried policeman his habits," he said quietly. As a shoe salesman will mentally catalog the shoes of the people sitting opposite to him on the streetcar, and a physician will mentally diagnose the ills of his fellow spectators at a baseball game, a policeman habitually views the acts of his contemporaries with one eye toward their motives. "Meaning what?" demanded Paul Grayson. The policeman faced Paul and said with a level voice, "So far as every bit of evidence goes, you are Paul Grayson. You behave as a man might behave when placed in the position you appear to be in. On the other hand, if you were a smart man, you would behave as you are now behaving, even though you had reasons most dire to execute as soon as you leave the watchful eye of law and order. This is a bit too trite. A stolen wallet containing only a few bucks and a whale of a lot of identification, complete with a witness to the crime, makes fine story material to use in establishing a false identity. Motive can come later, if any. If you are Paul Grayson, I will make abject apology. If your tale is not true, there will be some tall explaining to make." "How about Miss Phillips's boyfriend?" "Now that's a nice thought, but not necessarily conclusive proof. He might easily and sensibly be included to give any story an air of veracity. However, we can check with Toby Reed as soon as we get back to the patrol car." Paul Grayson awoke the following morning to the tune of the telephone beside his bed. "This is Sergeant Hollowell," said the other man. "I've just called to apologize once more and to tell you that everything is okay. We'll even give you a guard if you want it." Paul stretched and said sleepily, "Thanks, Sergeant. I guess everything will come out all right without a guard." "Okay. I'm glad for all concerned. For your information, and not to be repeated, the character we got last night was a petty crook with a record as long as your arm. A plain case of theft, interrupted luckily We call it closed." "Thanks again. And the ship?" "It's there as it was last night. So far as we and the BurAst guards know, no one but the crook was near it, and no one will be permitted to go near it until you come to take it up." Paul breathed easier. "Okay, see you later." "Your wallet, intact, will be delivered to your apartment within the hour. That closes that case, too." The policeman's voice sounded well pleased with himself and the night's work. Paul hung up and sprawled back in bed, thinking. There was no point in arousing the policeman's suspicions again. A howl of "Why?" might delay Paul Grayson, might cause another technician to be sent to Proximate 1 to check the arrival of the radio beam. Paul had all the reasons in the galaxy for wanting to be there himself, and an equally large quantity of reasons for not wanting someone else running his ship. But there was more to this than met the eye. Paul reached for a cigarette and laid back in bed blowing smoke at the ceiling. A smile touched his lips. Aside from the annoyance of being delayed for 24 hours, it had been one large evening. Then his grin died, and he reached out one quick arm and picked up the telephone again. He dialed a number and waited until the ringing was answered. "Stacy?" "This is Stacy's office." "Is he there?" "Who's calling, please?" "Tell him Paul Grayson, if he's up yet." "He's up," came the cheerfully amused voice at the other end, "but he's still grumpy." "I'll cheer him up," promised Paul. There was the click of a connection made, and one quick burr from the ringing of the distant phone. "Stacy," came the reply. "Paul Grayson. Hell's eternal. I thought you were on your way to Proxima." "Got delayed a day." Stacy was silent for a moment. Paul imagined that he could hear the clicking of the other man's mind as it started to analyze the situation. Then Stacy said, "What's on that technical mind, Paul? You didn't call me at this outrageous hour just to pass the time of day." "John, how much will it cost me to have a matter looked into?" "Normal charge is $25 a day and expenses. I think I owe you a few favors. Make it expenses if it isn't too involved." "It might be." "Then we'll make some arrangement as soon as we know how involved it is. But my God, Paul, what brings you to the employment of a detective?" "Someone tried to steal my spacecraft last night." "Nuts. Call the coppers." "Nope. There's more to this than meets the eye." "What, for instance?" "I'll be over to tell you about it." "Big?" "I don't know. Bothersome, anyway." "I'll wait. Make it quick." Paul hung up, and then went into a whirlwind of action. He dressed and shaved and gulped a glass of orange juice. He eschewed breakfast, promising his stomach that food would come in due time. He took his car from the garage where he had parked it for a month the evening before, and within a few minutes after hanging up the telephone, Paul Grayson was heading towards Stacy's office. It was a small office. Stacy's secretary knew Paul by sight, if not by telephone voice, and she nodded him in to the inner office. Stacy's inner office was as small as the outer office because file cabinets lined the room. The detective sat with his chin in his hand, poring over some pages of writing. He looked up at once and greeted Paul with a smile. "Someone tried to swipe your ship," he blurted. "And why isn't that a case for the cops?" "John, how would you go about stealing a ship?" "Get into the spaceport on some pretext, get into the ship by some means, and then take off like I had to make Messier 31 by mid-afternoon, or whatever place happened to be aligned at the time." "That's what I've been thinking." "So?" "You wouldn't worry about the dispersion factor. You wouldn't worry about course. Your main interest would lie in getting the hell out of there before someone came along and decided that you were intent upon theft." "Naturally." Paul nodded. Then he explained as well as he knew, and as well as he could remember, everything that had taken place on the previous evening. He finished up with, "So, I've met a gorgeous gal, kissed her by accident, and found it fun. was clipped by a footpad and sort of nursed back to conscious level by the same luscious dame. Had 2 rides in a police patrol car, 1 trip to the Hoosgow, cleared of all suspicion by an official courier arriving with officially sealed pouch of identification, was escorted home in style. Go on. There's more to this than that. Remember what Sergeant Hallowell said, that a stolen wallet and a witness were fine dovetails towards the establishment of a false identity. Yeah. What better way to louse Paul Grayson up than to decoy him with a flagrantly beautiful woman, a dame possessed of self-assurance and poise, yet incredibly feminine enough to betray a warm, human, passionate hunger for some one man. Natural male concupiscence would draw any man into the game of trying to divert her affection towards him. Speak for yourself, Wolf. Paul grinned at Stacy. He stood up. Maybe I'd better look into this thing myself. Set Stacy on the trail of a amorous female and... Sit down. I'm a married man. I was thinking of your poor, deluded wife and daughter. Gloria knows all about your natural male concupiscence, and Ginny will know you as a doddering old man by the time she discovers that you can tell a man from a woman without looking at their clothing. Paul sat down again. He had not intended to leave anyway. So he said, what better way to divert Paul Grayson than to bait him with a gorgeous dame? Stacy grunted. To divert you long enough to clip you, to steal your papers to enter your ship, for what purpose? That's where the mystery comes in. The guy had plenty of time to fire up the drives and grab an armful of sky. The galaxy makes a fine hiding place, John. They scoured the stellar systems of 100 and more suns before they found that Neosol had a planet that was capable of harboring Terran life without difficulty. God knows, no man hunting for a place to live would wait and head for Proxima I. Yet that seems to be what the crook had tried to do. Stacy shook his head. You are supposing that Nora Phillips was mingled in some sort of plot to steal a spacecraft. Granting that, Paul, explain to me one thing. Just why would a person intent upon delaying you go so far towards helping you? Huh? She did sort of rub your skull, didn't she? And a fine job she did of it, too. Professional? Seemed as if not professional, at least experienced. She brought you out of the unconscious, painful dark in time to intercept the criminal at his business? Uh-huh. And Nora Phillips strolled up and kissed you with warm, mad passion on the street, thus immobilizing your skull long enough for the enterprising sharpshooter to take a stance and perfect his backswing. So you don't think so? Stacy thought for a moment. This does not smack of simple theft, he said at length. Hell, growled Grayson, that's what I've been trying to tell you. Ah, I see. So someone looks like me. He tried to swipe my ship, it would appear, but they didn't need a dame to distract me. I could have been pushed off by a gunman. Frankly, I am of the type that will gladly hand over my wallet, my shoes, and or my worldly goods, rather than to have a hole drilled through my dinner. So, John, here is Nora Phillips' address. You can get the name of the defunct crook from the police, I'm sure. See what connection they might have had. Stacy looked at Paul with a smile. You're not making uranium out of broken pop bottles, are you? Nope. I'm just a guy working for the Bureau of Astrogation. Uh-huh. But with a secret under his hat large enough to keep him from yelping too loud. You know the reason for that. And how many others? Damn few, less than 6, I guess. Stacy shook his head. They don't clip screwballs for having a half-baked idea crammed into their simple skulls. So far as I can see, you've got nothing to conceal, nothing to steal, and nothing much worth hiding. If Haedaecker knew what I had... Stacy grunted. If Haedaecker wanted to stop you, he would not have to hire a bunch of phony actors to do it, he said succinctly. "But what else?" "My life of crime," chuckled Stacy, "tells me that there are as many motives for crime as there are men with ambition, avarice, and ability. The trouble is that there are more motives for crime than there are varieties of crime. If there is a motive for this cockeyed affair, and I've yet to see a crime without a motive, however involved or simple, you must know it." "Aside from spacecraft stealing?" "That's ruled out." "Then I'll be eternally relegated to the nether regions if I know what it is." Stacy nodded. "Maybe you know it and don't recognize it." "Maybe I should visit my family psychiatrist. He might be able to ferret out the hidden secret, but I'd waste no time on it. Just proceed and see what happens." "Like another busted head?" "As I recall, it's hard enough." Paul laughed. One could hardly be sour in Stacy's presence. Nothing appeared serious to the detective. He managed to make everything sound quite cheerful and amusing, even the threat of further depredations. It was a trait disliked by many people, which was probably the main reason why Stacy was a small-time operator instead of being the mainspring of a worldwide agency. It took a long acquaintanceship with Stacy before people realized that the light banter was only a false front used to keep Stacy's own spirits from bogging down in the world of trouble. A sympathetic sort himself, Stacy forced himself to treat every case as impersonally as he could, because only a man uninvolved emotionally can make clear decisions based on fact and not feelings. Newcomers meeting Stacy resented the fact that the detective obviously treated their troubles as less than the most important thing in the world. But Paul Grayson knew Stacy well, and he was willing to let the detective handle the case completely from this point, knowing that Stacy would do it honestly and quickly, friend or not. Paul waved goodbye at the door and drove towards home. He went in and sat down, ticking things off on the fingers of his hand. 1. Identification cleared. 2. Wallet returned. 3. Puzzle solution started. 4. Grayson went to the telephone and called the spaceport. Was connected with the calculations department. "Grayson," he said, "how's for my course this evening?" "Sure you want to go?" came the dry retort. "Absolutely. Want to bet?" "Look," grunted Grayson, no longer angry at the voice. "You've got a fine calculating gadget there. Why not have it figure out the betting possibilities and make book on me? We tried to make it pick a horse for us once, but the answer came back as data incomplete, factors uncertain. The Elecalc does not like horses." "But I'm not a horse." "I hear there's a woman tied up in this thing. That's the predictably unpredictable factor. That men, the imbeciles, will get involved with women, even as you and I. Anyway, Grayson, we'll have you a course. It won't be as cold turkey as last night's, but it will serve in a way." "In what way?" asked Paul. "We can't set the spotter ship. Not enough time. You'll have to aim the ship visually. It'll make the dispersion factor somewhat large." "I don't mind." "Good thing you don't," came the glum reply. Both of them knew that the job of aiming a stellar ship was accepted by the public as one of the things that had to be done. Few of them knew what went into the job. All stars are but pinpoints in the sky. There's no quick way to tell a close by star from a distant star by visual inspection. To the untrained, even the solar planets blend with the interstellar reaches. Only the trained eye can tell planets from stars by the lack of twinkle. The true distance between the stars is too vast to be comprehended. Men speak of light years, yet even the learned must indulge in quite a bit of cerebration to understand the length of a year. The velocity of light presents figures too extreme for comprehension. Light travels at 328 yards per millionth of a second. 328 yards can be grasped. As a distance of 3 football fields, but a millionth of a second cannot be grasped readily. 186,000 miles per second offers only one factor capable of being understood. One can count 10, 101 and realize that a second has passed. But the mind is incapable of grasping the fact that during that time of counting, a beam of light traverses 186,000 miles. Proxima Centauri is 4 light years away. Using the longest base that the solar system provided, the beginning and the end of the aimed course was like trying to hit a match head at 10,000 yards with a snub-barreled pistol. A misalignment too minute for the eye to see meant a probable target dispersion as broad as the outer orbits of the solar system. Aim a ship at a target 4 light years away, across aiming points a couple of light hours apart, at a velocity within a couple of % of precise, multiplied by a number of seconds mounting in the 5 or 6 figures, you can establish the volume which will contain the spacecraft on its arrival. A volume of probabilities far, far from the layman's idea of a precise science. Heading as he was for Proxima Centauri, that tiny star would be the focus of his aim. But Proxima is a tiny star, one of a trinary, and the other 2 magnificent stars overwhelmed the feeble light of Proxima. So the system of Alpha Centauri would lie on the crosshairs of Paul's telescope, and the crosshairs of the telescope would be displaced from the axis of drive by a small angle. It was this angle that required the use of the electronic calculator. Not only because Proxima lies a smidgen of space apart from the more brilliant pair, but because Alpha Centauri drifts along in the galactic swing, and Sol moves as well. The eye sees Alpha Centauri where it was 4 years ago. Any trip across space lasting 10 days must bring the traveler down out of supervelocity and into the realm of visibility at a position where Alpha will be 10 days after takeoff, not where Alpha was 4 years ago. This was a problem not yet licked. Like the sighting in of a brand new pistol, each shot fired added to the knowledge of the correction factor that must be applied. For the same reason of inward anxiety that makes a man who has missed a train on Monday turn up 2 hours early on Tuesday, Paul turned up at the spaceport early. The guard greeted him with a cynical smile, but checked the identification carefully before waving him through the gate. Paul went to the L-Calc office to get his folder of course data. The usual procedure was to have the course calculated as early as possible before the date of takeoff, so that the busy department could sandwich course data in between the longer range jobs. This was different. Undoubtedly, some long-range job had been stopped in mid-calc so that Paul's course could be run off. He was not too surprised to have the man at the desk smile and point a finger at the superintendent's office and say, "It's in there. Go on in. He's expecting you." Paul went to the door, opened it, and then swallowed a lump as large as his fist. The man sitting quietly behind the desk, huge hands folded in his lap, was Chadwick Haedaecker. Chadwick Haedaecker was a kind of man who collected college degrees, both earned and honorary, and had them lettered on his office door like a collection of trophies. He had enough ability and ambition to get to the top of his particular heap, and once he got there, he had garnered enough additional power to stay there. He was a tall man with piercing eyes and an indomitable nature, and he used both to quell any objectors to his plans, projects, ideas, and theories. 20 years of authority in a position where no man was permitted to doubt his word or argue with his self-assured proclamations had completely erased any trace of humility he ever had. But whether Haedaecker was a prince among men or a jackal among jackals depended entirely upon the beholder. When Haedaecker believed in your idea, he was a staunch supporter, throwing all he had, and he had plenty, behind your idea. His whip cracked just as hard in your behalf as it lashed against your back when Haedaecker was not convinced of the soundness of your idea. Since Haedaecker was head of the Bureau, his presence here made Paul blink. While Paul tried to think of something clever to say, Haedaecker smiled and nodded, finally speaking after he knew the state of discomfiture of his employee. "You've had quite a time, haven't you?" asked Haedaecker. Paul nodded ruefully. "Just what happened?" Paul explained carefully, completely. He would have preferred to answer Haedaecker with nods or grunts or shakes of the head on the theory that opening the mouth is the first step towards spilling the whole tale, or at least enough of it to give a man as cagey as Haedaecker to think that there was more equipment in the BurAst spacecraft than radio beacon checking gear. Haedaecker was not the kind of man to come forth to console a man, especially one that apparently came out of the deal with nothing lost. Haedaecker's principle was to get 'em off balance and keep 'em off balance, because when they're off balance, they cannot get set to swing. Paul knew that he would have to play this interview with the same finesse that a mouse should use to escape the cat's corner. "Have any ideas about this?" asked Haedaecker. Paul's ideas were all confused ones, but he did not say so. "The police accept it as a plain case of attempted theft," he said. "And you?" Paul spread his hands in a universal gesture. "I can't make more out of it than the police," he said. Haedaecker speared Paul Grayson with those piercing eyes. "You're not mixed up in anything, are you?" "Lord, no." Haedaecker's glare lessened. "I don't mean anything lawless or underhanded." Paul looked at Haedaecker coldly. "Then what else?" Haedaecker smiled blandly. "You are an ambitious young man. You are idealistic. You are enthusiastic and energetic. You are also determined." "Are those unfavorable traits?" asked Paul, with a slight edge to his voice. He hated this baiting, knew that he should take the sting of Haedaecker's acid tongue without flaring back. Haedaecker had Paul over the proverbial barrel, and from which position there is little chance for counterattack. "Listen to me," snapped Haedaecker. "You were 24 when you came to this department. 2 years later you came to me with an idea. You hoped to link the stars by voice. An ideal. A magnificent hope and plan for mankind on Earth and upon Neosol. For years everybody who had had a touch of space has been trying, testing, and experimenting towards that end. Men of learning, both abstract and concrete, men who have spent years studying that very idea." "What has that idea got to do with my getting a lump on the head?" queried Paul. "Only this. As a member of this department you are given a job to do. You have proceeded well and executed this job proficiently. 4 years ago, Grayson, I told you that the experiments you suggested had been tried. I was patient. I explained that there was a certain appropriation set aside for communications research, that the appropriation intended for this galactic survey was under no circumstances to be used for communications." "I remember that. I also claim that my experiments have never been tried." "Nonsense. I accepted your theory and have had other scientists check your reasoning. They state that there is no relation such as you claim. Now, to get back to the correlation between that crack you got on the head and my presence here, it goes as follows. Until last evening I let you alone. I knew that you continued to hold that mad theory despite arguments against it. But a man can have his dreams, and so I permitted you to dream. I assumed you to be honest. I believed that you would not defy orders and employ funds for Z-wave research. But when a man who has no great wealth, no vengeful enemies, no polygonal love affair, and no power to dispute or usurp gets involved in a tangle as well contrived as this, there is but one thing left.
I am convinced that you are planning to test the Z wave." Paul laughed bitterly. "Just why do you assume that this is some sort of plot? Why not accept it as an attempted theft as the police do?" "If I were a thief," said Haedaecker softly, "and managed to break into the spaceport, I would not wait until the guards came after me, then to drop from my stolen spacecraft and run. A thief does not need the spotter craft to lay his course. He takes off for anywhere so long as it is off and away. A man contrived to resemble you closely enough to pass superficial inspection follows you before the takeoff, clips you on the skull, and steals your wallet. You are the traditional technician, Grayson. You do not dress like Beau Brummel, nor do you show evidence of affluence. Any footpad would look for a more wealthy client. He knew you, Grayson. He clipped you for your credentials." "So? Why?" "I don't know. I can suggest a theory. Because he knew that you were going to try the Z wave." "Nonsense." Haedaecker smiled with a wolfish serenity. "Can you think of any reason why a man would want to put a monkey wrench into our plans to survey the galaxy?" "No." "Then it must be your wild schemes." "But just the same question, Dr. Haedaecker. If I were going against orders and attempting to test the Z wave, why would a man attempt to stop me?" "You are an idealistic simpleton," snapped Haedaecker. "You have a manner of convincing people of the worth of whatever idea you happen to hold dear. Despite the reams of evidence to the contrary, you have the enthusiasm necessary to convince people who have not the truth at their fingertips of the validity of your ideas." "Piling supposition upon supposition," smiled Paul cynically. "If that has been done, I fail to see any reason why any man would not want to be linked to Neosol by voice." "You have a lot to learn about human nature, Grayson. You'll find as you grow older that whenever someone proposes a plan for the benefit of mankind, there are violent factions that will work hard to circumvent it. How many leagues of United Nations have failed throughout history because of jealousy, aggrandization, megalomania, both personal and national? In one instance, after the bomb convinced all men that uniting as one was the smart, safe, sensible thing to do, people hailed with joy the creation of a new sovereign state apart from its neighbors. Another nation blocked amity because of an ideology. A third nation presented a territorial possession with its freedom and at the same time contemplated the addition of two new states to its union. Grayson, once a man rises above his daily job and tries to set up something beneficial to mankind, he will find other men who see that plan as a threat to their own ambitions." Paul leaned forward over the desk. "Why not let me try?" he asked eagerly. Haedaecker leaned back wearily. "We've been through all that. But why?" "I will not have one of my own men involved in an experiment as ridiculous as yours." Paul eyed Haedaecker quietly. "But—" Haedaecker shook his head. "You are not to attempt this." He eyed Paul angrily. "Who says I am?" demanded Paul. "Reason and logic. And," said Haedaecker coldly, "excepting for one thing, I'd go out and inspect that ship of yours for Z-wave gear." "But Paul Grayson is smart enough to smuggle Z-wave gear on earlier trips, not leaving his evidence for the last attempt. So I would find nothing at this time." Paul felt his heart pound thrice and then settled down again. The one thing that he was trying to avoid was not going to come off. But Haedaecker glared at Paul once again. "I absolutely forbid you to do this." Paul glared back. "What have we to lose?" "I'll not have the ridicule attendant to such an abortive experiment pinned onto my department." Paul laughed sarcastically. "It seems to me that a man in your position might like to have the name of being willing to have himself proven wrong." "What do you mean?" demanded Haedaecker. "Can your own personal ambition be great enough to block and forestall the linking of Sol and Neosol by Z-wave?" You young puppy." "Your position is due to the proposal of Haedecker's theory," said Paul. "I am not attempting to insult you, Doctor Haedaecker. I want you to view this in another light. According to all the evidence at hand, Haedaecker's theory is correct, and we cannot communicate with Z wave across interstellar space. The proposition of that theory and its math have made you a famous man. Perhaps you fear that if Haedaecker's theory is shown to be incorrect, you will lose your position. That is not so. Men have always been on the side of a great man who is humble enough to doubt his own theories occasionally, who is willing to see them attacked. It means a lot to mankind. Show mankind that your personal ambition is not so great as to prevent them from having the benefits of—" "You're talking as though you knew that your plan would be successful," sneered Haedaecker. "I believe it will be if I am given an opportunity to try." "I tell you that it will not, and I forbid you to try." Haedaecker speared Paul with a glance from the icy eyes. "You understand, whether or not the experiment might be successful, if I hear of you trying it, you will be subjected to every bit of punitive action that the law permits." Paul leaned back easily. "Now," he said with cool candor, "you're assuming that I have all intention of attempting it without official permission." "I would not put it past you. In fact, I believe you are." "All predicated upon the fact that a footpad belted me and swiped my wallet?" "Yes. For what other reason?" "Theft is usually done for—" Haedaecker stood up angrily. "I've heard enough," he snapped. Haedaecker strode to the door and hurled it open with one swing of a powerful arm. What happened next was not too remote a coincidence. It has happened to everybody several times. Someone with the intention of entering a room will brace themselves, turn the doorknob, and thrust, only to have the door open from the other side. The net result is that the muscular effort, tensed to strive against the mass and inertia of the door, will find its force expended against no resistance. Doors are pulled from one side and pushed from the other. If the shover pushes first, the would-be puller gets slapped in the hand with the doorknob, sometimes resulting in a broken finger or thumb. But if the puller pulls first, the shover finds himself catapulted forward by his own muscular effort. The result of this latter can be both comic or tragic. In this case, the result was a flurry of splash-printed silk, a bare white arm, a fine length of will-filled nylon, and the frightened cry of a woman. Paul gulped. Haedaecker's reflexes worked fast. He caught Nora Phillips before the girl went headlong to the floor, and he stood her up, retaining a light grip on her waist until she got her bearings and her breath. "Young woman," stormed Haedaecker angrily, "are you used to bustling in closed conferences?" Nora looked at Haedaecker with eyes large, luminous, and fetching. "I didn't know it was a closed conference," she said in her cool contralto. "I'm most sorry." "Miss Phillips, Doctor Haedaecker. She is the woman I met last night, Doctor Haedaecker." "What are you doing here?" demanded Haedaecker. "I did not know this was any kind of conference," she explained. "I came to see Mr. Grayson, and the guard said he was in this room, talking." "Why didn't you wait?" stormed Haedaecker. Nora smiled wanly. "I was excited," she said. "It may have occurred to you, too, that the man who tried to steal Mr. Grayson's spacecraft last night was not playing a game. Everything seemed wrong. He was not smart. I got to wondering why he just didn't get into the ship and take off. Well, less than 15 minutes ago, a flash came over the air. Among the news was the statement that the criminal killed last night in an attempted spacecraft theft was Joel Walsh. He was an escapee from penitentiary in Antarctica. That explained it." "How?" demanded Haedaecker. "Does that explain anything?" "Of course it does," said Nora. "He was in jail for 10 years. He must have been sent away when he was about 20. How many men are competent space pilots at that age?" "Not many," agreed Paul. and being in jail for the last 10 years, it's natural that he did not know how to run the ship." Grumbled Haedaecker. "He probably wanted to stow away," said Nora. "Once he did that, he could hold a gun at the pilot's head and make the pilot do his bidding until he learned how to run the ship." There was one fine flaw in Nora's reasoning, but Paul did not want to belabor this point at this moment. He had not intended to push Haedaecker to the point of firing him for impertinence, insubordination, or rank carelessness. For on the BurAst 33 PG-1 was the Z-wave gear that Haedaecker's vindictive nature accused him of stowing away. Paul laughed. "So much for your intrigue," he said. Haedaecker glared at Paul angrily. "Your intrigue," he said, with heavy emphasis on the first word. "Just let me find you trying it." Paul smiled crookedly and looked Haedaecker in the eye coldly. "Dr. Haedaecker," he said in a level voice, "if I ever try it and fail, no one will know of my failure. If I try and succeed, I assure you that you will be able to do nothing to me." Haedaecker nodded. His manner as cold as Paul's voice had been. The gauge had been hurled, the sword measured and weighed. So far it was a stalemate, but only until Paul Grayson really did something against the rules large enough to let Haedaecker really clip him deep, lastingly, and legally justifiable. Haedaecker left, and Paul turned to Nora Phillips. She smiled at him and asked, "What is this intrigue business, or is it a top secret?" Paul shook his head. "I'd prefer to tell you after I return." "Do that," she said. "I'd like to hear about it." Paul pondered briefly. The obvious thing was to offer her a chance to look over his ship. He could do that, now that he had all his credentials and papers back. But the Z-wave gear was evidence against him. And even though it was parked in a convenient locker, certain hunks of cable endings and associated bits of equipment were a dead giveaway. The same sort of evidence in the shape of capped pipes will tell the observer that plumbing once existed in a certain room. Paul had no intention of trusting anybody at this moment. Mayhap Nora's timely information about the deceased thief were true. Still, there was a hole in her tale. If the thief wanted only to stow away until takeoff time, he would pick another spacecraft than the BurAst PG-33-1. The registry number glowed in luminescent paint a yard high, and matched the numbers on his identification card. Certainly no half-idiot would try to stow away in an official ship that was almost certain to be investigated as soon as the hue and cry was heard. He suspected Haedaecker's hand in this. Anything to keep Haedaecker's theory in high gear, to keep Haedaecker top man in his field. He might as well suspect Nora too, at least until motive or innocence could be shown. He decided to lie glibly. "Nora, I could take you aboard and show you the crate," he said, "but this is an experimental run and subject to security, though I'll not be able to explain why they think it so." Nora laughed and shook her head. "Spaceships are cold, powerful, and dangerous things to me," she said. "I'd feel uncomfortable on one of them." "Then let me show you the elecalc." "What?" "Elecalc. Short word for electronic calculator. I'm here to get an aiming point for my trip tonight." "Now that I would like to see," said Nora, hooking an arm in Paul's. "I'm pointing for Alpha Centauri," said Paul, "and so that's what we calculate for." Nora looked at the bays of neat equipment and shook her head. "Why not aim at it and run?" she asked. "Surely you do not need this $1 billion worth of stuff to point out your destination." "We do," objected Paul. "You see, if I took off with my telescope pointed along the axis of drive, with the crosshairs pointing at Alpha Centauri, I'd be heading for the star where it was 4 years ago. I intend to be on the way for 9 days. So I'll want to point the nose of the ship at the spot where Alpha will be 9 days in the future instead of 4 years in the past. Since Sol and Alpha drift in space, the motion and velocities of both systems must be taken into account, a correction angle found, and then used to aim my ship. My telescope will angle away from the ship's axis by that correction angle. Add to that the fact that I'm taking off from Earth, which will give me some angular velocity and some rotational velocity differing from a hypothetical takeoff from Sol itself. Furthermore, I want Proxima Centauri instead of Alpha, and that must be taken into consideration too. Then there is the question of velocity and time. We cannot see when we are exceeding the velocity of light. We must run at so many light velocities for so many seconds. A minor error in timing or velocity will create a rather gross error in position at the end of the run. "Oh," said Nora, but her tone indicated a lack of comprehension. Paul smiled. 1 second of error at one light velocity equals 168,000 miles of error. 1 second of error at 100 times the velocity of light equals 18 millions of miles error. Not much as cosmic distance goes, but a long way to walk. Nora understood that and said so. Grayson's data had been handed to him by Haedaecker, but apparently the long-range calculations that had been temporarily halted were still halted, for the operator was taking his opportunity of feeding some future flight constant information to the big machine. It was not a complex calculation, as some computations may go, but there were a myriad of factors: Terran latitude and longitude, the instant of takeoff as applied to the day and the year, an averaging of previous dispersion factors noted from previous trips, velocities, vector angles, momentum, and others, all obtained from tables and entered into the machine before the start lever was pulled. The machine mulled this information over, tossed electrons back and forth, chewed and digested a ream of binary digits, and handed forth a strip of paper printed with an entire set of coordinates in decimal angles. Paul showed Nora his folder of data. "The rest," he said, "is up to me." He led Nora from the computation room, intending to hit the dining room for coffee. Halfway across the lobby of the administration building, he was hailed by the auto call. He went to the telephone. It was Stacy. "I've a couple of things to let you think over," said Stacy. "So?" "I've been on the job. I haven't much, but there are a few items you might mull over." "Shoot." 1. Your deceased thief was an ex-convict, escaped from the penal colony on Antarctica. "This I've heard." "Then I suppose you know that the guy was cashiered from the Neo-Terra run for smuggling." "Huh?" blurted Paul. "An ex-pilot, tossed out on his right ear for conduct hardly becoming a safecracker and a thief, let alone an officer and a gentleman." "That I didn't know. How long ago?" 5 years almost. It was not quite the 10 that Nora had claimed. "Well, that makes it." "That ain't all," came Stacy's voice. "The weapons carried by the space guards are regulation police positives. Our erstwhile felon was shot once right between the eyes with a .45, which according to all of the expert opinion came from an automatic at a distance of 3 feet plus or minus 6 inches. Know what that means?" "I'm just digesting the information now. You tell me." "It means that the ex-crook was killed by a party or parties unknown, someone other than one of the guards. Furthermore, he was facing his executioner, not taking it on the lam. How do you make that?" "It doesn't make good sense." "Sure it does. It keystones nicely. Men of that caliber are often chilled because they fumble a job, and the mainspring doesn't enjoy the prospect of having a fumbler running around with information that might lead to the capture, arrest, conviction, and or demise of aforementioned mainspring. They made one error. They should have used a .38 revolver instead of a .45 automatic. The .45 is a gangster's weapon, and they should have drilled their ex-companion from behind between the scapula to make it look as though the guards were better shots than they really are." "That's food for thought," said Paul. "That isn't all," said Stacy. "Here's one more bit of information that may be either juicy or full of sawdust, depending upon how you taste it. Your girlfriend, Nora Phillips, was born and raised on Neoterra." "You're certain of that?" "So the Bureau of Vital Statistics claims." "But how?" "Negative evidence, my fine scientist, negative evidence. I offer you two alternatives. Either she was born on Neoterra, or she is employing an alias, pseudonym, or nom de jour." Stacy's French lacked a certain vocabulary, but it was none the less to the point. "She is certainly not born Nora Phillips of Terra. I'll let you pick your choice. But enough of that. A couple of hours ago she received a telephone call. Nice position she must have. She chinned for about 3 minutes and then leaped to her feet and took off like a jet propelled. Didn't bother to say anything to the management of the joint at all. Then—" "Where does she work?" asked Paul. "Timothy McBride and Webster, attorneys at law. We couldn't tap their telephone, but we had a lip reader peering at her through a telescope from a room in the building opposite hers." "What did he catch?" "Nothing. She just listened and then took off. And can that dame drive! If we didn't have an idea where she was going after the first few minutes, my man would have lost her for certain. She's with you now?" "Uh-huh." Paul thought fast. Just what unearthly reason why people would try to stop his plans for creating voice-fast communication with Neosol, Paul could not fathom. Obviously, there was one faction working against him. But how had they— Paul paled. Had the criminal hoped to lay Paul low enough to keep him quiet until the criminal could take off in Paul's place? True identification would be impossible once the crook were in space. But what could he accomplish? Certainly. Suppose the thief that clipped him intended to place Paul in a position where he could be captured easily, to take Paul's place to perform certain acts in Paul's name, while Paul was held captive. Then once those acts were consummated, Paul could be found in the wreck of a spacecraft or the ruin of a radio beacon on Proxima Centauri 1. But why? Columbus had been kicked around for having screwy ideas, and the Brothers Wright had been thoroughly laughed at, but people did not try to murder characters who had cockeyed ideas. Of course there was Galileo, but Galileo had publicized his screwy ideas, whereas Paul Grayson's theories were known to very few. But Nora Phillips could not be held as part of that particular mob. It seemed to Paul that the woman had done a fine job towards keeping Paul hale, hearty, healthy, and imbued with ideas available to a man in the finest of health of mind and body. If Nora belonged to some group intent on stopping Paul Grayson, she was working against them too, for she had done a fine job of soothing the headache out of his skull with fingers that acted with experience and practice. On the other hand, Nora Phillips had behaved as though she wanted Paul to succeed, and she acted, if this were an act, as though she enjoyed her work. So what had really happened last night when Paul Grayson was clipped unconscious? Had Nora forestalled them? Nora was quite a woman. Her loveliness was not the untouchable, fragile, bandbox variety, perfection that must not be marred by a misplaced hair or wrinkle in the frock, or a clue of rouge printed offset from her own ripe lips to her own smooth cheek by Paul. Nora was all desirable woman, and neither complete dishabille nor minor imperfection would mar her appeal. Paul recalled the lithe slenderness of her body. Her sculpted arms were molded with the smooth, well-balanced muscle of fine tonus. Her waist was slender but not too soft. "Hey, are you there?" "Yeah, Stacy, I was thinking." "Don't think so hard. Look, Stacy, can you tell me whether the man who clipped me turned up with scratches on his face?" "I don't know. Why?" "Just a loose end. I might be able to find out." "Take a swing at it. but it's not too important. Okay, Paul, have I given you something to think about?" "More than," said Paul soberly. He hung up, turned, and saw the guard of the previous evening standing nearby, about to go on duty. Paul went over and asked, "Hi." "Hello. Say, I'm sorry about last night." "Forget it. You were doing your duty. But can you tell me, did the guy who used my identification last night have any scratches on his face?" The guard frowned in thought. All he had was some well applied makeup, and a fine job it was, too. He looked me right in the eye. "No marks?" "Not a trace." Paul smiled and went back to Nora, thinking furiously. Something must have interfered with their little plan. He looked at Nora, lissome, lovely, as lithe as a tiger, all desirable. But maybe it might be a good idea for him to learn her desires, to ascertain her limit before he took any liberties with her beautiful white body. Intelligent women did not scream or faint these days, nor did they rake their attacker with fingernails. They employed judo. Now, if Nora Phillips knew judo, it was plausible that the erstwhile footpad, instead of finding an inert victim and an hysterical woman, discovered that the woman was capable of defending her outraged dignity, revenging their cowardly attack, and thwarting any further plans the criminal had for them both. It would explain, in part, why the criminal's little idea did not culminate as expected, if Nora Phillips knew judo. Paul smiled faintly. He had not changed his mind about Nora Phillips. She was still the type of woman that would react unfavorably to any crude attempt at approach. Regardless of whether her interest in him were an act, swift passion, or the awakening of tender love, Paul knew that she would not employ the punishing judo holds upon him if she knew judo. On the other hand, Paul believed that instinct might react faster than intellect, and that her first instinctive move would give her away. So Paul took her hand as he came close to her. He drew her forward, his free arm gliding toward her waist and around it. Nora's free hand moved forward and upward, touched his cheek, and then went around his neck. The hand that he held came free and joined the other. She was warm and supple in his arms, and her lips were soft and clinging. It was a satisfying emotional experience. Intellectually, it proved nothing that had not been empirical knowledge for a couple of millions of years. Paul would never learn whether Nora knew judo by that method. He abandoned his primary intrigue for the moment and indulged in one of his favorite indoor sports. Then she moved back a bit, and Paul's hand slipped to either side of her waist. "I could learn to like this sort of thing," he said. Nora looked up into his eyes. Her own eyes were a trifle dreamy, but a trace of smile lurked in the deep corners of her mouth. "But how do I know you'll be true to me?" she asked him in a voice that sounded like pure soap opera. "In space?" "I've a dame in every port," he told her. "I'm true to 'em all." "But why so many?" chuckled Nora. "Variety." Paul let go of Nora's waist and she stepped back a bit. He turned around and started leading her the rest of the way towards the coffee shop. "I've a couple of hours left," he said. "I'd prefer to soak up some dinner in candlelight with music et al. But Ptomaine Joe's is handy. I've hit so many snags so far that I'm inclined to find me an advantage and then sit on it until I'm safe in space." Nora shuddered a bit. "Safe in space," she said softly. "That's a strange thing to say." "Why?" he asked. "So far out there, away from the friendly earth, nothing solid to stand upon, nothing to—" Paul laughed. "No footpads to raise lumps on the skull, no taxicabs to dodge, no—" "No women to kiss." "You've convinced me, but I'm baffled by you. What kind of job do you hold?" "Why?" "It isn't everybody that can pick up and leave their work for an idle afternoon." "Oh," and her laugh was genuine. "I'm a librarian for a large office of lawyers. I can get away because of polite confusion. No matter who misses me, he assumes that I am looking up a batch of stuff for one of the others. There are so many of them that they couldn't possibly get their heads together close enough to check up. Actually, I'm doing that just often enough so that I can play hooky once in a while and not get caught." Paul laughed with Nora. He felt at ease with her, and her presence made him forget all of the niggling little questions that bothered him. Time passed swiftly enough to surprise them both when the announcer called the time and number of Paul's space flight. "This is it," he said ruefully. "So it is," she agreed. "There's another day." "I'll call for it when I get back." "Do that," she said. It was not a tone of command. It was more a tone of absolute agreement. It pleased him. "Raging vegan gorgons couldn't stop me," he chuckled. He reached for her, and she went into his arms forward for a good-bye kiss. Paul made the most of it, gave it all he knew how to give, and for his efforts he received a pleasant promise for the future in return. Nora leaned back in his arms, took his hands from around her waist, and turned him to face the spaceport door. "It's that way," she said in a throaty voice. She gave him a gentle shove. He went through the door and out upon the space field. Walking across the sandy floor towards a spacecraft numbered BurAst PG-1. Actually, the spacecraft was quite close to the shape of a hen's egg. It stood upon its smaller end, supported by 4 heavy vanes that held the drivers. Above them, the bulge of the hull swelled out in the gentle curve, and about the place where the soft-boiled egg gourmet cuts the top off of his breakfast food, the hard metal stopped, and the upper curving dome of the spacecraft was made of window. Not a clear expanse of glass, but more like the greenhouse roof. Small facets set between rigid girders in a neat and efficient pattern. The girders were reasonably heavy because each one held shutter flaps that would snap close if the pane of glass beside it became pierced because of contact with cosmic detritus. At the very top of this dome the glass was smooth sheet, polished and unbroken. This section, a full 10 feet in diameter, was optically perfect, for through this dome of glass the spacecraft was aimed. If the stars actually were where they looked to be to the eye, there would have been something less of a problem. A set of precision crosshairs set along the axis of the ship's drive could be used as a line of sight aiming point. Like a ship near the shore, the bow could be aimed at the pier, the power set, and then the rest would take care of itself. But stars move in their heavenly way. A poor 10 to 50 miles per second can become a rather awesome gulf after 4 years. Alpha Centauri is a little more than 4 light years away. That means that the stars, as seen by the naked eye, will be quite some distance from where it really is. Students of trigonometry will understand. A second of arc will subtend a cosmic sign at the end of 4 light years. To help the pilot, the spotter was used. The spotter was a tender spacecraft that roamed the solar system far out from Sol. 2 light hours away it was. When one of the starships was scheduled to fly, the elecalc would compute the course, and the big telescopes would direct the spotter spacecraft via the Z-wave until the distant ship was directly in line of aim between Terra and the calculated spot in the heavens where the distant star would be at the end of the ship's flying time. Once the spotter was properly located, 2 hours before the takeoff time, the spotter would emit an atomic spotlight for half an hour. 2 hours later, the light from this immense searchlight would arrive at Terra to provide an aiming point for the space pilot. The ship could take off on this line of sight, aiming for it directly. Of course, by the time the space traveling ship reached the spot, the spotter craft would have moved aside, the light would have ceased, and the starship was heading for deep space with nothing to impede its course. Paul was handicapped. The spotter was not available. Lacking the spotter to use as a point of aim, Paul was forced to choose the aiming telescope in the dome instead of the more precise crosshairs on the optical glass. This added to the error, And to add once more to that error was the fact that spacecraft in flight tend to revolve along their driving axis so that the angle between the true line of flight and the aiming point changed in angle. Paul would have to use Alpha Centauri itself as a point of aim. The correction angle was supplied by the observatory and applied to the aiming telescope in the dome. A lot of minute errors that added up to a gross at the end of flight. Basically, the job of the Galactic Survey would remove one of the errors, that of the crude measurement of distance between the stars themselves. Paul was a good pilot. He cut the aiming star close and watched it in the scope until it disappeared. He was now in that blackness that surrounded every ship during the faster than light speed. He was on his way. Nothing to do for 2 weeks but wait for the course to end. Nothing to do but sit and think and plan and dream. To think of Haedaecker and the Z-wave. To plan for the future when his discoveries brought him fame and fortune. To dream of Nora Phillips. Paul began to hum, and after a moment or two the humming broke out into a full-throated but dubious baritone. Round and round and round go the deuterons. Round and round the magnet swings them. Round and round and round go the deuterons. Smack in the target go the microamps. Buried in the loose powdery dust that covered Proxima Centauri I, a spacecraft lay concealed. 10 miles across the blazing flatlands of dust, Galactic Survey Station 1 was clearly visible. From the station, the spacecraft blended so well with the dust that it could not be seen. Only a sharp observer who knew where to look and what to look for could have seen the turret of the spacecraft lofting above the dusty plains. The long-barreled machine rifle would have been invisible to the sharpest of eye. Several miles to the other side of the survey station, there were a group of furrows kicked up in the plain where test bursts from the machine rifle had landed. A television detector was set upon the area between the concrete landing deck and the main space lock of the survey station, so that any erect moving object that intersected the detector line would cause the machine rifle to fire so that its projectiles would pass through the moving object. The man in the hidden spacecraft had been playing solitaire for day upon day. The record of his score on the wall of the ship was long and not too honest. Eventually the detector alarm rang and he dropped his cards. He ran to shut off all the detecting equipment because detecting equipment itself could be in turn detected, and he wanted no reprisals. He set his eye to the telescope and watched the new arrival. Paul Grayson landed his ship on the concrete apron and donned space attire for his walk across the airless planet to the station. He came from his ship, and though he had seen it countless times before, Paul paused to view the beauty of the airless midnight sky. He looked for Sol, hidden in the starry curtain. He looked at Proxima, a tiny star, but utterly brilliant at this distance. It blinded him. Luckily, the beautiful binary of Alpha Centauri was behind the little planet, and he was saved the hurt of looking at that brilliance. With the same thrill of anticipation he had enjoyed for day upon day now, Paul turned from his ship and started to walk toward the station. What he might learn there would change the thinking of the galaxy. It was the culmination of years of thought and experimentation. It was the crux of the matter, the final evidence that would give Paul the weight and the conviction. From here he could go on and up. Here, now, at any rate soon, was the incontrovertible truth. He checked his gear thoroughly, but it was force of habit caused by the desire of his own safety. He had planned well. He had forgotten nothing. He chuckled happily. He had forgotten nothing. The lithesome sweetness of Nora Phillips and the promise of complete fulfillment was sweet recollection. When Paul returned to Terra, he would have the world on the palm of his hand. to hold tightly and to give to Nora. His eye caught a bit of glitter in the dust of Proxima I, and he stooped to pick it up because Nora might like a crystal from a far planet. He did not hear the passage of bullets over his bent back because Proxima I possessed no air to carry their sound. He could not hear the cursing of the man in the spacecraft hidden 10 miles across the dusty plain, nor could he see the frantic effort to readjust the sighting mechanism of the machine rifle. 5,000 feet per second was the muzzle velocity of the rifle in space, and because there was no impeding air, the bullets had taken 2 seconds to travel from gun to target position. In those 2 seconds, Paul bent over, causing the burst of fire to miss. There was no second fusillade. The enemy had had too little time to readjust his sights. The enemy had also been overconfident, so had not prepared for a miss. The radio was silent. Only the crackle of cosmic static came from the speaker to show that it was alive. The Z-wave was even more silent, for there was no interfering cosmic energies to make Z-wave static. Paul set up the test equipment and checked both. They were obviously hot and awaiting the arrival of some signal in order to burst into full-throated life. Then he settled back to wait. How long, Paul could not tell. Actually, the measurement of this matter was the basic reason for Paul's being here. The books set Alpha Centauri at 4.3 light years from Sol. Ergo, a beam of light or a radio wave should take 4.3 years from transmission to reception. 10% error would cause a variable of almost 5 months. An error of 1% adds up to 2 weeks. The observatories had admitted an error of 1% as a maximum, and considerable space travel between Proxima I and Terra had diminished this error to an absolute of about 3 days plus or minus the nominal. Paul had been gratified to discover that despite his delayed take-off, he had arrived at Proxima before the radio signal arrived from Terra. Paul had been worried about his delay, and he had driven his ship hard. Not during the days of faster-than-light travel, of course, but after Paul had come down out of the blackness and could set a course by inspection. He had been either lucky or proficient. Even using a not too precise method of aiming his ship, he had still emerged from the blackness less than 5 million miles from Proxima, which was very good aiming indeed. Pilots always aimed for their target on the nose. For one thing, the dispersion was huge, because the slightest irregularity in any phase of the maneuver would throw off the point of aim by millions of miles. In years and years of space flight, the first direct hit upon target had yet to be recorded. In fact, 5 million miles was considered brilliant piloting, or as is more possible, it was brilliant luck. Then as Paul found his landing spot, he had pushed the BurAst PG-1 hard enough to make her plates creak, and Paul had descended at full 4 gravities all the way to the ground. He had arrived before the radio signal had reached the planet, and that was all he cared about. So he settled back to wait. There was little to do but sit and think, and to watch the occasional meteor shower land on the dusty ground. There had been an extensive shower about 10 miles from the station shortly after his arrival. The impact was, of course, both invisible and inaudible. But upon impact, the dust spurted upward, billowing and flowing, like the column in miniature that came from an atom bomb explosion. Since there was no air on Proxima I, the billowing dust rose and spread apart until the individual dust motes lost its energy and fell back to Proxima I by gravitational attraction. He would have liked to inspect that particular spot because the shower had been spectacular. A number of meteors in a close-knit group had landed, sending forth a series of dusty columns, some of the larger of which were still visible when the radio chattered into life 3 days after his arrival. It came all at once, and its sound dimmed his ears and re-echoed from the smooth walls of the station. The sound snapped Paul from his place by the window dome. It grated on his ears until he could rush downstairs to the radio room to turn the volume gain control down so that the audio signal fell below the overload point. From a raucous, nerve-tingling screech, the volume fell until distortion no longer fouled up the filtered purity of the single note, broadcast from far off Terra 4 years ago. Paul measured the signal strength and found it entirely satisfactory. He coupled the recorders to the gear and then settled back to await the arrival of the modulated timing signals that were transmitted after an interval of straight tone, the first period to be used for establishing contact before the actual timing of the transmission time began. Once the radio signal was coming in perfectly, Paul turned his attention to the Z-wave receiver. He turned it gingerly, cautiously. And then it came to life. Paul cried in exultation. He was successful. True, it was a weakling signal that faded and died at times, but it came in strong and clear enough for recording in the periods of good reception. A bit of work and research, and the construction of a real interstellar Z-wave station would remove this fading. Paul snapped the extra recorder on and then began to dream his dream again, this time more strong than ever before. He had connected the Z-wave equipment at Terra's Z-wave Central to the big interstellar radio transmitter, lacking a Z-wave transmitter for his own use, so that now he was hearing the Terra end of conversation. It was a woman's voice that talked from Terra to someone currently on one of the planetary outposts of Sol. "But it won't be long, my dear." "Of course, it seems so." "Do that by all means." "In a month, you say?" "I'm very happy about that." Here the signal faded for a full minute. It returned again. "Terry said so." "How do I know?" "By all means, my dear." And here again the signal faded. But it was enough. Exultation filled Paul. This was proof. This was the door, opening for life upon everything he ever hoped to gain, everything he hoped to be. It gave him what he wanted to offer life, and by happy circumstance he had found the one he wanted to offer it to. He could go to Nora, not as a technician in the Bureau of Astrogation, but with a grand future of success and opportunity to build ever upward and ever onward to real fame and fortune. Not the real success in his hand, for when the final success in life comes, ambition and desire begin to wane. But far more exhilarating was the hope of success, the chance to work for a magnificent future together. He gloated for hours, measuring the radio signal as few radio transmissions have ever been measured before. Then, with his work finished, Paul packed up to leave. The glittering stone he held in his hand was nice, but tiny now, compared to his tale of success. A bright rock from a far-off planet, not much more than a seashell from a distant beach. With a chuckle, he tossed the stone aside and broke out the sand jeep. Nora might like a meteorite from far Proxima I. At least, it was a souvenir to be quite in evidence wherever it might end up. He headed for the meteor shower of 3 days before, and found it after an hour of running across the featureless sands. The area was small, which in itself was strange, for meteor showers covered miles of area, not square yards. The sands were pocketed with small craters, and Paul looked at them until he found a crater of medium size where the rock was still showing. He hefted the stone from the sky and carried it to the sand jeep. On his way back to the little buggy, he caught sight of a glitter less than 50 feet away. He dropped the stone in the back of his jeep and strode over to see what could be glittering this brightly in Proxima's veritable sea of bland, yellow sand. Then he stood dumbfounded, for the glitter came from the circular disc of glass, the eyepiece of a space suit, which was buried in the sand. A crater of irregular shape surrounded it, and the meteorite was lying in half exposed view. Paul dropped into the crater and lifted the stone to disclose a nauseous clot of brownish blood, the remnant of a space suit, and contained in it the remains of a man. Mostly buried by the impact, the man's body stood almost upright, the headpiece at ground level, while the rest of the body was curved brokenly backwards down in the crater, driven into the sand instantly by the meteor. Paul shrugged and removed the helmet. The face was vaguely familiar. The man wore clothing under the suit, but there was no sign of identification in it. The face bothered Paul, however. He believed he had seen it somewhere. Not only that, but just exactly why any man possessed of sane mind would be on Proxima I, save Paul who had business there, was a mystery at its best. Paul stood up and looked around the plane. He caught another glitter and got into his jeep to investigate. It was the semi-submerged spacecraft, and Paul wondered at it. It was smashed flat by a gigantic meteor, ruined beyond any hope of reconstruction. Paul tried to enter to inspect it. It had been too badly wrecked by the meteor. Abandoning the spacecraft as a hopeless job for immediate identification, Paul went back to the lone victim. There was still something vaguely familiar about the man's face. The difference was not because the vacuum of Proxima had distorted the face, for the suit had been sealed at the break by the meteor and the sand, and there was no distortion. Paul pondered. Identification might be possible by dental means, by prints, by iris matching, if the face distorted on his way back. There was his refrigerating gear aboard the ship. Paul could stick the corpse in there and hope that some light could be shed on this mystery. Paul folded the lower ruined portion of the spacesuit to preserve whatever minute bit of air it contained, and packed it on to the jeep. He shoved the body into the freezing cold of the storage bin with a grimace of distaste, and determined to dine on canned beans for the duration. It annoyed him to hurl several pounds of fine, well-hung tenderloin steak onto the bald sands of Proxima I to make room for an unhung corpse, but it had to be done. Then, with the mystery still gnawing at his mind, Paul fixed the drive scope on Sol, made a few adjustments, and set his auto drive and micro timer according to the data supplied before his departure from Terra. It was a corrected for duration course, the reverse of his approaching orbit. Paul clicked the drive and headed for Sol. When the ship dropped into invisibility, he relaxed. Busy all the time of his stay on Proxima I, he felt seedy. While still pondering the problem, Paul shucked his clothing and showered. Water, both hot and then chilled, did not help his memory any. Nor was it the memory of Nora Phillips that made him lather his face and shave. Not entirely, for the 3-day beard made his face uncomfortable, and it was personal comfort rather than white man's burden that prompted Paul to reap his beard. Like most men, shaving was not a pleasant occupation, and when no matter of personal appearance insisted upon a smooth face, shaving was postponed and indulged in only when the factors of discomfort balanced one another equally and in diametrically opposite directions. Paul grinned at his clean face in the mirror. "You know," he said to himself in the glass, "you're vaguely familiar, too." The idea hit him hard then. One of the reasons why a picture of oneself does not resemble one's familiar appearance in a mirror is due to the lack of facial symmetry. The left side of a mirror image is the right side of the face on a photograph, and the two seldom match. Paul gulped and dressed quickly. Then he went to the freeze locker and hauled out the dead man. It would take a third observer to tell, but so far as Paul Grayson could tell, this man from Proxima I was his double. "And that," he said in address to the corpse, "makes two of you." 10 days later, when Paul's ship dropped out of the realm of invisibility, he was no nearer to the problem's solution. He did have a course of action formulated, however. So his first telephone call was not to Nora Phillips. It was to John Stacey, the detective. "I'm back." "Glad to hear it. What happened?" "I've got a corpse on my ship." "Friend of yours?" "Nope." "Look," came the cheerful reply, "if you want to murder someone, go ahead. But there's no sense in putting yourself in jeopardy by carrying the mortal remains around with you. Why didn't you dump the thing out in space?" "I want it identified." "Now, for the first time in years, you make sense." "Thanks." "But look," said Stacey suddenly, "just what kind of mess have you gotten yourself into?" "I don't know. I hope to find out." "Well, it's thick." Paul blinked. "I know it. But why?" "You answer that one. It's your question." "What's new?" "Nora Phillips is missing." "Missing!" exploded Paul. "Where did she go?" "I haven't been able to find out yet." "What do you know?" demanded Paul. "Damned little. She left you on your departure day and started to drive back to town. Instead of returning to her office or going home, she turned off on Bridge Street and stopped at a mansion, number 7111 to be exact. Drove her car into the garage as though she were expected. Hasn't come out since." "You haven't kept a man watching the place for all this time?" "No, but I've had a gent prowl the joint at least once a day for the last 2 weeks, and the car is still in the garage. You can see it through the windows of the door." "Didn't she come out?" "Garage is connected to the house. She could have gone into the house without breathing fresh air." "That's 7111 Bridge Street?" "Check." "How about her job?" "By careful inquiry we've learned that she resigned. By letter." "How did you get that?" "Well, law outfits seldom take kindly to characters asking leading questions. But an advertisement appeared for a librarian, and I had Millie fill it. She pored through the personal files and found a typed letter of resignation, terse, disappointingly uninformative." "Her apartment?" "She ran a 3-room job alone. A man appeared, armed with a letter from her. He packed up her stuff, and it was removed from the premises by the Haedaecker Moving and Storage Company. It is currently there in storage, with a bill paid in advance for 6 months." "Any more?" "I had Morton inquire about a rental at that address, and he was told that Miss Phillips had to return home because of illness of her father. That's all we could get. Morton got that information from the landlord after expressing first a desire to live there, and second, asking why the previous tenant moved out. Put it so that the landlord had to show him her letter to prevent a possible tenant from thinking that there was something odious about the premises." "Then what?" "That's all. Morton considered the place apparently for several days after putting down a $20 deposit. Gave it up and forfeited the deposit on the grounds that his wife wanted a 4-room place." "Huh. Gone without a trace?" "Seems so, excepting that she went into 711 Bridge, and we've not seen her since." "How long did you watch?" "Constantly for 10 days. Not a sign or trace of her there." "But—" "Yeah," replied Stacey's unhappy voice. "We cased the joint, too. I had at least 7 operatives hit the front door on every sort of pretext, from stolen nylon hosiery to roofing salesmen, and from governmental surveys on this and that to gents who insist that they look at the electric wiring, the plumbing, and the foundation. The joint is owned and tenanted by an elderly gentleman who has retired. His wife lives there too. One servant, a doddering old fogey, who must have been the owner's father's gentleman's gentleman." "What's his name?" "Hoagland." "How about the car in the garage?" Paul could almost hear Stacey shrug. "So far, there is nothing suspicious about it from a legal standpoint," he said. "You'll have one hell of a time proving anything. So a woman, not too well acquainted with you, resigns from her position on a perfectly logical grounds, moves from her apartment on similar grounds, and deposits her car in a strange place and disappears. But that last is the important thing. She disappeared. Yeah? Where does her father live? Maybe she did go there. You're the detective, said Paul. Chase it down. That will cost like hell, warned Stacy. Paul laughed. What I've got will pay for plenty from now on, he said. I'll reopen the case then. You shouldn't have closed it. Stacy groaned. How did I know you were that anxious? I was. Okay, but I wanted your approval before I broke this thing wide open. Will it? Sure. The first time I go to 711 Bridge and ask about that automobile in the garage, which is registered under the name of Nora Phillips, someone is either going to get nasty, call the police, or start asking me embarrassing questions that might lead to Paul Grayson. Stacy, the guy I found dead on Proxima I, is another dead ringer for myself. That makes two characters killed off that resemble me. It looks like a plot to me. How was the deceased rendered that way? He was hit by a meteorite. Act of God, I calls that, muttered Stacy. You wouldn't go so far as to suggest that God is on your side. When a meteorite hits a man and a spacecraft in the same shower, both of which are prowling on a planet where they had no business and shouldn't have had any curiosity, it begins to look as though celestial mechanics, formerly run by the act of God, might have been given a little aid and aim by the Machiavellian hand of man or men unknown. How could you aim haul it to the right spot and drop it from a good height from a spacecraft? That's for the big one that wrecked the ship. Carry a boatload of little ones and drop them on the head of the character you desire to erase. Not one of them penetrated to the depths I'd have expected, now that it comes to mind. Okay, Paul, I'm on the trail again. I'll send a man to collect your corpse, and we'll attempt to identify it. Maybe that will give us a lead. Check, said Paul, and he turned away from the telephone with a heavy heart. He recalled the lissome warmth of her body pressed eagerly against him. Could a woman offer herself falsely with that much ardor? Paul's clenched fist came down upon the palm of his other hand in a loud, determined smack. By all that was holy, Paul intended to find out. He answered his question honestly. Yes, there are women who could play an act, do literally anything humanly possible to obtain their wants. On the other hand, Nora might have run afoul of whatever interest it was that apparently stood in his way toward linking Sol and Neosol by Z-Wave. Had he been uninterested in her as a person, he could have shrugged it off with but a minimum of hurt and wonder. But Paul made up his mind to find out about her, to take either one or two courses as far as Nora Phillips went. If Nora were in league with those who stood against him, he wanted the dubious pleasure of showing her that she could have been better off by following a more naturally honest plan. And if Nora Phillips were in trouble because she was seen in Paul's company, he wanted the extreme pleasure of belting the living hell out of her abductors personally while she watched wide-eyed, and then escorting her gallantly to some place where pain and strife could be relegated to the background. To do either, Paul must not stop working towards his goal. With determined step, Paul headed for the offices of the Terran Physical Society with his personal recorder, upon which the semi-conversation from the Z-Wave was impressed. This time it would be Grayson's theory, and it would be presented to the TPS without the possibility of Haedaecker's interference or scorn. Charles Thorndyke was a man well worthy of the scientific honors he owned. Unlike Haedaecker, he did not flaunt them at every hand. He used them only when it was necessary. And unlike Chadwick Haedaecker, Thorndyke was the kind of man who would have rejected his own pet theory instantly upon the first glimmer of proof that he was in error. He listened to Paul's tale with growing interest, and then he listened to the recording. "This is a big thing," he told Paul after Grayson was finished. "It's my greatest hope realized. We have a lengthy paper on extrasolar gravitational phenomena to be presented next Tuesday. I'm going to cancel that for your presentation." Thorndyke looked at the ceiling. "The chance of voice communication with Neosol is as great an advancement as the discovery of the telegraph," he said. "It must not be delayed one moment." "I've always believed that," said Paul. "Why didn't you speak up before?" "Dr. Haedaecker has always vetoed any such suggestion." "Why, for the love of heaven?" "He said that everything had been tried." "Balderdash!" exploded Thorndyke. "Negative evidence is never conclusive." I could not argue with him. Thorndyke smiled. He nodded. Being armed with a hope and a firm belief is poor weapon against a man as deeply entrenched as Haedaecker, whose minor pronouncements made news, and whose hand could write an appropriation for $1,000,000 to pursue some experiment. Once this is presented, you will no longer be a small voice crying out in a veritable wilderness. You will probably end up with a job to do as big as Haedaecker's. I can't understand him." "Nor can I." "You're certain that you presented your idea correctly?" "So far as I know. I've been talking about this thing for years, ever since I got the idea." Thorndyke laughed. "I know what happened," he said. "Your initial idea was but half formed and therefore incorrect. But as you improved upon it, your own arguments became trite to yourself and even less convincing to Haedaecker, who was convinced against your idea. He'll have to change his tune next Tuesday." Paul left in a fine state of mind. He was ahead of the game for the first time in his life, and he enjoyed the feeling. The question of who or what wanted to stop him was something that he could never find out until the other side made another move. As for Nora Phillips, following her trail was a job for an experienced man like Stacy. The third item was Haedaecker. Paul did not agree with Thorndyke. Haedaecker was not merely misled in this thing. Haedaecker had good reasons why he wanted the Z-wave experiment hushed up. Haedaecker's theory had been the making of the man himself. Once that theory was broken down and shown incorrect, Haedaecker would no longer be the great mind that he had been. Haedaecker liked power and adulation and naturally was disinclined to let it go lightly. Paul expected trouble with a physicist, and Paul would have preferred to circumvent trouble, to go around it, to avoid it. But Paul was experienced enough to know that the act of avoiding trouble more often made the trouble pile up until it reached terrifying proportions. So instead of staying strictly away from Haedaecker's office, Paul strode boldly in. Forewarning the enemy of your intentions is said to be bad, but now and then telling the enemy what you are going to do, and then daring him to try and stop you, will make him back up, because it tends to convince him that you are equipped to do as you want to do, regardless of opposition. Chadwick Haedaecker greeted Paul cordially. "Everything go all right?" he asked. Paul nodded. "The reports on the radio signal have been turned in, complete with recordings and my own comments." "Good." Haedaecker turned to a map on the wall. He consulted a list beside the map. Then he turned with a smile. "That was the first," he said. "The next signal doesn't come in for almost 6 months. Then, my young friend, you will be the busiest man in space for the next 2 years, hopping hither and thither to check in the network. I'm glad that everything went as expected." "Everything did." "Good. This first one was the one that proves we're right. Now that we've got one checked in, we can take the rest with less wonder and concern." Haedaecker looked at Paul sharply. "But that isn't all you came to tell me about." "No," said Paul quietly, "it is not, Dr. Haedaecker. I am not one to fly a false flag. I dislike the idea of thrusting a man's ideas back down his throat abruptly and in public." "Just what are you driving at?" demanded Haedaecker. "Upon Proxima Centauri 1, I definitely proved the error of Haedaecker's theory. I received a Z wave. Ridiculous." "I did," stated Paul flatly, "and so I'm telling you because I feel that you should have some opportunity to protect yourself." "I need no protection." "You have always defended your theory viciously. You have never permitted the merest possibility that you could be wrong. I have proof now." "Impossible." "I have," said Paul, "and I intend to show it. So if you care to make any statements which will change your previous attitude, do so." Haedaecker looked at Paul queerly. "Just what would you recommend?" he asked. Paul smiled. "If I were you," he said, "I would accept the defeat of your theory graciously." "Indeed." Paul made an exasperated noise. "I'm only trying to save your embarrassment." "You insolent young puppy! You trying to help me!" Paul took a deep breath. This was not going well at all. But on the other hand, Paul knew that he was no longer a small voice to be throttled by the mere gesture from Haedaecker. Paul was in full control of the situation, whether Haedaecker realized it or not. Furthermore, the years-long awe of Haedaecker and his iron-handed rule had not left their ineradicable mark. Unlike the child ruled by stern parents, who defers to their orders long after maturity because of habit, Paul's former deference was gone. Perhaps the only difference was that the parents seldom lose their command or respect because the maturing offspring learns as the years go past that their seemingly arbitrary rules were actually born of wisdom that the child could not understand. Whereas Haedaecker was a god with feet of low-grade clay. When the mighty fall, they fall far and hard. "I was trying to save you embarrassment," snapped Paul. "Once the truth is known that you refuse to permit any experiment because it might shake the foundation of Haedaecker's theory, your entire policy will be destroyed." "So what would you have me do?" "Why not sponsor this idea?" suggested Paul. "Be the first to proclaim happily that Haedaecker's theory was in error, and that now you join in the hope of connecting Sol and Neosol by real communications." Haedaecker shook his head coldly. "I'll sponsor no such ridiculous thing," he said, "because it cannot be. You—" "But I have proof." Haedaecker stood up. "You have not." "I have," thundered Paul, "and I intend to show it." Haedaecker sat down again and placed the fingertips of each hand against the other, making a sort of cage. "Now I'll warn you," he told Paul. "Your proof is false, whatever it is. And if you should make the mistake of making a public spectacle of your efforts to disparage a well-founded law of physics, I shall take measures to ensure that you never make such an idiotic error again." "Why don't you fire me?" taunted Paul. "As soon as you publicly violate my rules, I shall." "Then come to the TSP next Thursday," snapped Paul, "and watch me break both your rules and your theory with one fell swoop." Haedaecker shrugged. "I'll be there to watch you make a fool of yourself," he said. Paul turned on one heel and left. Stacy's voice was as dry as ever. "Busy, Paul?" "Just polishing up my talk," he said. "I'm due to lecture in an hour." "Well, don't be nervous." "I'd be less nervous if I knew what was going on." "This might help. First, your corpse was none other than a 3-time loser named Clark, and a pot full of aliases, none of which are worth mentioning, as dead as a mackerel." "What are we going to do about him?" "It's been done." "How?" "Don't ask." "But isn't this disposing evidence?" "Sure, but if any crime has been committed, he did it, or attempted to. He is no loss to the community." "But that is against the law." "So is kissing a woman who is of no relation to you in public in this state," chuckled Stacy. "You only get involved in a lot of official curiosity if you disclose the death. That will get you a grilling and a mess of suspicion to fight against. Well, the birds who set 'em on you will be forewarned. They'll be free to plot further while you are busy defending an innocent stand. Besides," he added with another chuckle, "there is nothing like making them chew a fingernail wondering just where their plans went afoul. Let them scurry around instead of you. If I guess right, they are not quite certain whether the man now talking to me is Paul Grayson, bona fide, or their little masquerader. But why, for the love of heaven? Look, mes infante innocente, this is twice that you have met a character made up to resemble you. This means an intended masquerade. I don't know why, but I'd bet a hat that there is a motive to it all. The last was so obvious that Paul saw no reason to comment. Stacy continued. One more item before I go away and leave you to your test tubes. Nora Phillips. Yes, came Paul's eager reply. Posing as a man making a survey, myself, twiggled on the doorbell at 7111 Bridge Avenue this afternoon, after canvassing the entire neighborhood up to that point to make it look good. Go on. Nora Phillips is their niece. The elderly gentleman said so. She parked her car there for the time being, since her pappy, brother to his wife, is desperately ill on Neosol. So, she'll be back, but they didn't know when. Get her address? Couldn't get too curious, no. Damn. Why? Somehow, Nora is tied up in this, on my side. Okay, I'm going to follow one other lead. Take it easy, Paul, and give the physicists hell. I'll try. I will begin at the beginning, smiled Paul, wishing he had the air of a professional lecturer and the literary ability of an author. Space was first conquered by rocket propulsion. Eventually, a base was established on Luna and the space stations set up. Operating in space, the physicists discovered the supervelocity drive, which, like electricity, was used long before people began to understand it. The rocket is a clumsy device and ill-adapted to anything but limited professional use, but the superdrive made space travel practical for the ordinary man. Space was truly conquered then, and today men live on Venus and on Mars, precariously and uncomfortably, but they live there. Men have spread throughout the solar system, working in mines and medicinal farms and jungles. Their tenure of employment is dictated by the rigors of life on these inimical planets of soul. With a superdrive, explorers chase through the nearer galaxy, seeking a planet suitable for colonization. While most stars have been found to have planets, there was not one found that filled the bill until they located Neosol and Neoterra, both of which resemble Sol and the Earth to a fine degree. Radio linked the colonies of Sol, and after Neosol was colonized, radio linked its spread out colonists. 40 years ago, Carrington discovered the Z-wave, an outgrowth of the superdrive. Then the instantaneous Z-wave replaced the slow radio transmissions that required teletype and code communications, and voice-to-voice contact prevailed throughout the solar system and throughout the system of Neosol. But the Z-wave did not cross the gulf of interstellar space, and years of experimentation followed, all of which failed. Then, 20 years ago, Chadwick Haedaecker suggested the theory now known as Haedecker's theory, which tended to show that the Z-wave propagated because of the fields of force generated in the central cores of stars. Since that date, only desultory attempts have been made to test the Z-wave in deep space. Experimentation had stopped for all practical purposes. About the only people who have given the matter much thought are students of theory and a couple of hardy souls like myself who, I have been accused of and, which I must admit, hope to become rich and famous by making some extraordinary discovery. I will now advance the idea that I hope will eventually be known as Grayson's Principle. The basis of Grayson's Principle is that the Z-wave will not propagate between the points that have not been previously linked by electromagnetic waves. This caused a storm in the auditorium. A showing of frantic hands flowered above the sea of faces, and the hall broke into a growling murmur of muttering voices, discussing pro and con. The chairman came forward and spoke to Paul. "Shall I call order, or would you prefer to have a mid-lecture discussion?" Paul smiled nervously. "I was prepared for this," he said. "The rest of this will run better if we get this one point settled. It will be too long from now to the end of my lecture to make these men hold their questions." "Good," smiled Thorndyke. He rapped for order. "Gentlemen," he said, speaking over the incomplete attention, "Mr. Grayson has just made a rather shocking statement which is cause for controversy. He has suggested himself that a mid-lecture period of questions will hasten our understanding of his theory." There was a burst of applause, and the flowering of hands went up again. "Edwin Johnson," said the first man, naming himself, "granting it takes light 140 years to cross between here and Neosol, I suggest that the entire galaxy has been coupled by electromagnetic waves for 2,000 million years." "I said linked," explained Paul easily. "This question is one that stumped me for a long time and was possibly the one thing that prevented the advancement of the principle long before. But the detectors we employ to detect those frequencies we term light are not similar to those we use for the longer frequencies of radio, even though both are electromagnetic waves. Light will not travel along a conductor, although it is true that the longer waves will be transmitted through a waveguide made of dielectric that is transparent to them. Ergo, it is the means we use to handle these frequencies that establishes the linkage rather than the medium or the wave itself." "I'm Fred Hughes," said the second. "Do you mean to state that the Z wave has never been known to operate between points not previously linked by radio?" "That is right." "You investigated everything?" "Mine is negative evidence, I admit. This is why it is hard to establish as truth. But remember, the solar system was linked by radio long before the Z wave was discovered." "How about spacecraft?" "Once the Z wave linkage is established by its forerunner of radio, it is complete and cannot be broken." "A spacecraft employs radio until it reaches the superdrive point. Then—" "I have had no opportunity to check this point as yet. I believe it has to do with a Doppler effect. Remember that the selectivity of the radio used in space is such that a Doppler shift will not detune it grossly. Obviously, superdrive will completely ruin such tuning." "But has this been tried?" "Yes. It was once hoped that we could link Neosol that way. The connection failed as soon as the ship entered superdrive." "But interplanetary ships employ Z wave." "I have had no opportunity to check this on an interstellar scale. I shall at the earliest opportunity. It is my belief that the radio beacons between Earth and Venus, for instance, are maintained at both ends by receiver and transmitter, the receiver being used to control the transmitter and keep the beam properly centered and to check its presence. This contact made in both directions along the space lanes maintains the operation of the Z wave on the ship, running at higher than the speed of light. The radio is, of course, useless. But the Z wave, propagating at some figure we cannot measure yet, suffers no Doppler effect." "I'm Grant Ludum," said the third. "Has the Z wave ever been tried in the depths of interstellar space?" "Yes." "Did it work?" "Up to a certain point." "Then why didn't they pursue it?" This answer demands that we all understand the psychology of the human being and the mechanics of the scientific method. I will answer this first by analog. Presume for the moment that radio cannot propagate across the space that communication has not crossed previously. Then consider Marconi on his first attempt to send radio waves across 100 feet of vacant lot. What is the method used in testing an unknown method of communication? The transmitter is started, and the operator either calls or signals by waving his hands that the transmitter is now working. As soon as the hand signal is seen, the receiver is checked, found to be working. Remember, this radio works because of previous linkage by communication in accordance with our hypotheses. Success is noted. Then the distance is increased by many miles, from mountain top to mountain top, and a blinker system is employed to carry the experimental information back and forth. Again the transmitter is started, and the blinker used to inform the other party that he is to watch for the radio's response. Again it works, since communications have been established. For the third time, the radio equipment is separated by the antipodes of the earth, and a telephone or telegraph connection is established. Again the transmitter is started, and the signal is sent. Again there is success. Now, gentlemen, the inference is that radio will work to a distance encompassing the entire earth. Now postulate a spacecraft taking the same equipment to the moon. Lacking radio, no means of communications are practical. Let us say Venus instead, gentlemen, since a magnesium flare might be used from Luna. So, on Venus, there is no means of communication other than radio, which depends first upon the establishment of other means of communication ere it will work. A failure is noted. Now, smiled Paul, this is what happened in deep space. I would like to read an excerpt from the Communication Expedition number 3. 2 spacecraft were dispatched from Pluto and proceeded outward for approximately 1 light hour, as established by the timing wave from Pluto. The Z-wave was tested and found available. Here follows a couple of columns of figures regarding signal strength and so on. At 100 light hours, the same test was made and found successful. At this point, gentlemen, remember that they used a timing wave from Pluto to establish their distance, which established radio communications. Now remember the techniques employed in such tactics. It is not necessary for the spacecraft to wait 100 hours for the arrival of the wave. The wave is sent forth 100 hours before the ship gets there, so that no waiting time will be necessary. In fact, they tried it at 1,000 light hours, since that was the distance previously established by the timing wave from Pluto. Again it worked successfully. The timing wave had been started about 1,200 hours before, and as usual, it was so coded that at any point along the line, the ship could stop, listen in, and mark the time. It was, sort of, like a rope with a series of knots in it. Having made this approximation, the ships went into deep space, about 3 light years distant from Sol, where they were not closer than 3 light years from any star. At this distance, the radio signal from Pluto had not arrived, and they had no idea of waiting for 3 years for it, since they did not conceive of Grayson's principle. But they communicated with one another. 1 light hour waiting for the timing wave, and it was shown successful. I read again. At 10 light hours there was no success. Our technical officer then spent many hours checking his equipment, while the navigating officer used the scooter to run back and forth with spacecraft Burr-Ast 7331 to ascertain whether the Z-wave gear was in operation. The arrival of the timing wave distracted his attention for a period of about 5 minutes, during which he established the separation between the 2 ships. Upon returning to the Z-wave equipment and completing as many investigations as to the sensitivity and function, he was satisfied that it was in operating shape. At this point it was tried again, and 20 minutes of two-way conversation ensued, proving that the Z-wave was operative at a distance of at least 107.38 light hours, as established by the timing wave. Second Technical Sergeant Frankfurt Brown was reprimanded for removing the Z-wave gear from the rack and panel and placing it on the test bench and thus wasting many hours. The equipment was again tried at 1,000 light hours, but no success was found, even though 10 or 12 hours ensued during the listening test. Because our supplies were now running low, the test was abandoned at this distance, and here, gentlemen, follows an account of at least 100 hours of testing constantly with the two ships at varying distances. Success came sometimes, complete failure at others. There is a complete set of spatial maps, but these show no contours of signal strength nor correlation. Only a man who believed that the Z-wave followed radio communications would establish such a correlation. "And how was this correlation located?" asked Luden. "Because I noted that when failure came, it was noted at distances. Approximately 10 light hours, 15 light hours, 3 light hours. But when success came, it came at 7.98 or 14.42 light hours. In other words, gentlemen, they knew their separation only when success came, and they could measure the distance accurately by the radio timing wave. During this time, the hands were dropping as the answers to one question answered questions of others. At the end, there were no more hands upraised. Thorndyke then said, 'We are now ready to continue with this lecture.'" Paul took a gulp of water and started off again. "I have one other item to bring forth. I have been working with the Galactic Survey." And Paul went on for many minutes explaining in detail what they had been doing and why. He finished up with his determination to test the Z-wave in accordance with his own theory. Then he said, "I have here a recording made over the Z-wave receiver I took with me to Proxima Centauri 1. As you know, the Interstellar beacon was erected on the top of the Z-wave central building. No visual connection seems necessary, but we all know that dielectric or permeabilic couplings serve in many places far better than a conducting link. It is my idea that similar factors of permeability and capacity will be found in the Z-wave. However, Z-wave central is all supplied from one power line. Here is a physical connection. Upon my arrival at Proxima Station, this Z-wave recorder was started with a radio. You will hear in the recording, which was made through a microphone to pick up the rune sounds as well as the Z-wave broadcast, the arrival of the radio signal from Terra, the timing signals, a few of my own comments made, I must admit, in the stress of enthusiasm, and finally the Terran side of an interplanetary Z-wave conversation between a woman and her man. While I deplore any public airing of the personal affairs of any man and woman, this is of the utmost importance to civilization. While the subject of her conversation is such that she can have only pride in having it made into history. For, he added softly, hers is the voice of true, honest affection, faith, and trust in her mate, and such is well worthy of a monument in the halls of history. There was a round of good-natured applause at this moment, and then the recording rang out. "But it won't be long, my dear." "Of course. It seems so." "Do that by all means." "In a month, you say?" "I'm very happy about that." The signal faded, and in the background the audience could hear the measured cadence of the radio timing signals, with a few of Paul's own personal comments of exaltation. Then the Z-wave signal came in again. "Terry said so. How do I know?" "By all means, my dear." Paul turned the recording off amid the thunderous roar of applause. With a smile of self-confidence, Paul faced the cheering auditorium and gloried in its praise. It, this moment, was payment in plenty for years of struggle and of being a third-rate voice crying against the stone wall of authority. He took their cries of praise with a deferent attitude, but remained on the podium, which indicated that he had more to tell. They subsided after minutes of wild applause, and Paul continued. "Across the galaxy between here and Neosol," he said, waving a hand which caused a wall curtain to rise, showing a planar map of the star region between the two inhabited systems, crisscrossed with red and blue lines. "The Galactic Survey has a veritable network of radio beacon signals. From star to star they go, directly, in cross triangulation, in collateral paths, and in long sweeps. The red lines show what distance these radio signals have progressed as of 3 days ago. The length of the continuing blue lines show the distance between the stars yet to travel ere contact is made. Such is the separation of stars in our galaxy that the next 3 years will see greater numbers of final contacts made. I shall be a busy man, for I will be making these final contacts one by one until the entire pathway, tortuous as it will be at first, is open to Neosol. Gentlemen, they drove the Golden Spike in 1869, coupling America's East and West by railroad. 3 years, 2 hours, and 45 minutes from this very instant, we shall drive the Golden Key home in the Z-wave link between Mother Earth and her distant daughter, Neoterra. Again came the thunder of applause. "Thank you," said Paul. "Are there any more questions?" "One," called a voice from the rear. "Yes." "This recording of Z-wave was made from Z-wave Central?" "Yes." "Just for the purpose of circumventing any such odium of doubt, is there any method by which you can definitely determine the time of origin of this recorded transmission?" "Not at the present. It can be established by the radio beacon records that I was on Proxima I at that time. What I hope to do is to have the unknown woman come forward and identify herself and the time she used the Z-wave." "Then other than that there is no way of proving that this recording might have been made on Terra a month before you left?" But Thorndyke interrupted. "Gentlemen," he said, "no man in his right mind would attempt a fraud upon this body. I have no doubt, I firmly believe that Paul Grayson has presented evidence that he has collected in true scientific honesty." This brought another round of cheering, and in the midst of it all the questioner came walking down the aisle toward the platform. Out of the shadows he came, and Paul tensed for the imminent battle of wits, for the questioner was none other than Chadwick Haedaecker. "Where did you get that recording?" he shouted over the cheers of the crowd. "On Proxima." "On the Z-wave?" "Yes." "Dr. Thorndyke, may I have the stage for a moment?" Thorndyke nodded, wondering what this was all about. Paul stepped aside as Haedaecker took the podium. "Gentlemen," said Haedaecker, "for some number of months my young friend here has been avidly attempting to force me into trying experiments made years before. He has a personal ingrained belief that Haedaecker's theory is at fault. You have heard his alleged recording?" "Alleged?" stormed Paul. Haedaecker held up a hand. Then he pointed out to the audience. "Dr. Haddon, could this message have been passed through the Z-wave Central?" A hush fell on the auditorium. Haddon rose and cleared his throat. "According to my records, Z-wave Central was inoperative for a 14-day period immediately following Paul Grayson's departure for Proxima Centauri I. Certain repairs were needed, and the Z-wave equipment was shut down for that period. All Z-wave messages terminating on Terra were shunted through the auxiliary tandem Z-wave station at Oahu, Hawaii. The Proxima beam was shut down, too, since the radio signal emanating from it would not reach Proxima for 4 years, and that which Paul Grayson was sent to measure had been emitted 4 years ago. It was not deemed reasonable to maintain the beam." Paul gulped. "This is preposterous!" he roared. Haedaecker merely smiled. "So is the truth," he said sourly. Thorndyke said, "Then, Dr. Haedaecker, it is patently impossible for the energy relation to have caused the transmission of the Z-wave such as Paul Grayson suggests?" "Impossible." Thorndyke faced Paul. "Then why was this farce perpetrated?" This was no farce, Paul almost shouted. Haedaecker has always discouraged anything at all that would cause him to retract his own precious theory. He will lie, cheat, and steal. Thorndyke turned to Haedaecker. Can this be true? Haedaecker smiled genially. Grayson is young and dreamily hopeful, he said blandly. Grayson has all the hope and faith for mankind that a savior, a saint, or a complete idiot might have. He believes firmly that if enough people want something to obtain by sheer effort, willpower, and determination, they can make it so. But why was this done? Grayson hoped to stir up enough hope to have a research group assigned to crack this impossible problem. It is not impossible, now, Paul was shouting. Haedaecker shook his head. You have no evidence whatever. You are now where you have always been. You base your argument on a hope and a prayer, but have nothing concrete to show for it. Haedaecker faced the auditorium with a raised hand. I am a physicist, he thundered, and I have been reviled by my former employee, Grayson, for attempting to suppress any ideas that would show Haedaecker's theory might be an error. This is a cruel attack, unwarranted and unkind. Like my fellows, I firmly believe that theory always must be bent to follow fact, that when any theory is confronted by experimental evidence to the contrary, it is the theory that must be changed, because the fact remains indisputable. But let one man show me the error in Haedaecker's theory, and it will be relegated to the discard by no one quicker than Haedaecker myself. God knows, gentlemen, I despair of offering a theory that stands against the innermost wishes of mankind. Thorndyke turned to Grayson. Where did this recording come from? I made it on Proxima. Possibly, said Haedaecker scathingly, but by what method? It was made honestly, shouted Paul. Honestly, sneered Haedaecker. With both the Z-Wave Central off the air and the radio beacon inoperative, both important factors in your pet idea were not running at the time you claim that this recording was made. Paul shook his head angrily. If the Z-Wave Central and the beacon were turned off, he stormed bitterly, then how did I receive this on my Z-Wave receiver? Haedaecker's voice was wholly scornful. A well-planned script, he said, written and acted by an accomplished actress, recorded by Grayson, doubtless. Mr. Grayson, your plea that this unknown woman on your record came forward for honor and identification might be accomplished. Which of your many girlfriends did this? Snapped Haedaecker, with his sudden verbal attack. No one. Paul stopped as the familiar voice on his recording went through his brain, as it had so often since he heard it on Proxima I. But it won't be long, my dear. Of course, it seems so. Do that by all means. And as the well-remembered voice seemed to speak aloud, Paul recalled another voice, the voice of a most attractive woman, replying to his suggestion that he call her. Do that by all means. Then Paul knew, not only the voice, but the mannerism. Do that. Not truly a command, but far more than mere acquiescence. That was Nora Phillips' way, her voice, her mannerism. A cold sweat broke out on Paul Grayson's forehead. 2 men had died because of this. Why? Truth, both were criminals, but what possible attraction could Paul's grand dream of interstellar communication have for a thief, a felon, and a murderer? 2 men had died, and then as Haedaecker's technicians cut off the hoped-for source of signals from Z-Wave Central, Nora Phillips had come forward to supply Paul with the necessary evidence to success. Why? Certainly she could not hope that his unsupported story would stand up against the certain statement that Z-Wave Central was down and out. Besides, there was not time for a spacecraft to get to Proxima I between the time the Z-Wave Central went off the air and the time that Paul recorded the signal. Had Nora Phillips been on Proxima? Someone had. Someone had been there, lying in wait for Paul Grayson, for what inexplicable reason Paul could not begin to name. And someone else had been there too, lying in wait for the interference. Someone had irrevocably removed the criminal lying in wait for Paul, and then had blithely furnished Paul with the signal he had been waiting 4 long years to hear. The answer was hidden behind the heavy mahogany door at 7111 Bridge Street, despite the placid appearance of a man retired from business, his elderly wife, and a doddering manservant. For Nora Phillips had disappeared behind that door. "What have you to say for yourself, young man?" demanded Thorndyke. Paul blinked at the chairman. He was completely stunned, absolutely beaten, shocked to the core. He shook his head. "I swear," he began. He was interrupted by the shout of "Fraud!" from the rear of the auditorium. Instantly the place was in a violent uproar. Those who had applauded the loudest were now shouting for Paul's head. "Fraud! Throw him out! Liar!" The stairways at either end of the stage filled with hoarsely shouting men who came up slowly but with determined step, gaining confidence as they advanced. "Throw him out!" screamed the voice. "Out! Away!" Thorndyke hammered on the pulpit with his gavel. He might as well have snapped his fingers at the hurricane. The rap of authority was lost in the disorderly cry of an angry mob. Men of learning, wisdom, education, their civilized veneer hurled away by disappointment, anger, and the smell of fraud, came forward with animal hatred, intellectually naked. Paul looked wildly around the stage as the foremost of the mob came to the top of the steps. This was the time for escape. Whether he was right or wrong, honest or the fraud and liar they called him. No time for argument, only flight. He faded back against the curtain. They came forward at him, warily, awaiting some move of his. Had Paul moved fast, they would have leaped like predators. So long as he oozed back with no overt move, they prowled instead of jumping. Perhaps the only remaining vestige of their lifetime of training was their desire to wait until he struck at them first, that they wanted Paul to strike the blow that would invite them to strike back. This was a mob, lynching mad. Paul looked over their heads to the fire exit. It was the only avenue of escape, but blocked by 20 madmen. He pressed back against the curtain, wondering if he would get out of this alive. Then the howling died like the turning off of an overloaded sound amplifier. For out between the curtains stepped a burly policeman. His nightstick was firm in his right hand, the thong wrapped tight around his wrist. The business end of the heavy stick rested in his left palm. His revolver hung in the holster, its safety strap unsnapped. He was the very essence of authority, big, uniformed, immobile. The advance upon Paul stopped. Paul breathed a prayer of thanks. "You're Paul Grayson?" he asked. "I am." The policeman's voice was flat, hard, and dry. "Did you know there was a dead man aboard your spacecraft?" Paul blanched. Stacy had said. "Uh-huh. You do. Paul Grayson, I arrest you for implications in the murder of John Stacy. Better come quietly, and remember that anything you say may be used as evidence against you." Stacy? The world took a quick spin about Paul's head. Stacy! There was a sudden motion and the quick lash snap of handcuffs while Paul's tired mind was still racing in the dream world of complete disbelief. He went woodenly with the policeman. Behind him he heard Haedaecker say, "And now it is murder to boot."